FBI detective, this video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 101, Find the Bald White Man. At noon, Jacob Federal Building. Riyadh pushed open the door of the number 5 investigation team office area and shouted loudly as soon as he entered, "Everyone, I'm back again." When the agents of the number 5 investigation team heard the voice, they all stood up, walked over with smiles on their faces, and gave William a hug. William patted Riyadh's back hard. "Welcome back, Riyadh." "Don't say that, William." Riyadh patted William's back gently, then rolled his eyes and said, "I was only away for 2 days, not 2 years. William smiled and didn't say much. Riyadh looked around and didn't see Roan and Lassie. He tilted his head and asked, "Where are Roan and Lassie?" "They went to make simulated portraits." Mona next to him handed Riyadh a cup of coffee, briefly told him what happened in the past 2 days, and finally said, "They have been gone for the whole morning, and they should be back soon." "Okay." After listening to Mona's narration, Riyadh nodded, returned to his workstation, and prepared to wait for Roan to come back. He wanted to find Roan for something. Ryder didn't know exactly what happened that day. Fentanyl was so toxic that before he could react, he felt his head start to drift. The next second, he couldn't control his muscles and collapsed to the ground. But before Ryder lost consciousness, he still felt Roan jumping down the stairs and rushing to his side. However, Ryder didn't feel Roan feeding him the medicine later. At that time, Ryder, in his words, had seen the white-bearded god waving at him. Later, Ryder woke up and looked at the ceiling in the ward. For a moment, he couldn't tell whether it was true or false. It was not until Ivan slapped him hard in the face that Ryder realized that he was really alive and didn't go to see God. Ryder went to the homes of the 2 SWAT members who sent him to the ambulance last night and thanked them very solemnly. The remaining person who saved Ryder's life was Roan. According to what Ivan knew, Roan was not the one who personally sent Ryder to the ambulance, but Riyadh, who had been in battle for many years and had just joined the FBI, had a feeling that Roan seemed to be the one who really saved him. Although he didn't know why he had this feeling, Riyadh chose to trust his intuition. He now wanted to express his gratitude to Roan very much. "Everyone, the simulated portrait is out." Riyadh hadn't sat down for a few minutes when Lassie and Roan strode in. Lassie held up several large portraits and shouted loudly, "This guy is the one we are looking for next." "Okay, no problem." The technicians of the number 5 investigation team agreed loudly, took the portraits from Lassie, sat in front of the computer, and started typing on the keyboard. "Roan, Lassie." Roan was stunned when he heard someone calling him. When he looked up and found that it was Ryder, he immediately smiled and walked up to give him a hug. "Welcome back, man. I didn't expect you to come back to work today. Didn't August disapprove you for a long time?" Lassie didn't hug Ryder, the muscular man, but just punched Ryder's arm with a smile on her face and high-fived Ryder. Ryder knew who Lassie was, and he didn't care about such a small matter as not hugging him. After hearing Roan's words, Ryder was about to say something with a serious face, but William on the side suddenly shouted, "Everyone, this Kevin may not have been to prison. There are no guys who look like Kevin in the photos of prisoners in several large prisons in the New York area." At this point in time, facial recognition technology is not very mature, and there are very few people who can be checked. Most of the people in the FBI resource database are prisoners who have been to prison. After all, these people will take photos before entering the prison. Facing the rest of the ordinary people, the current facial recognition system is useless most of the time. It was not until 2015, when the United States began to promote facial recognition boarding policies at airports across the country, that the FBI's database gradually became richer. Of course, the database here refers to the criminal database. There are other databases within the FBI, but ordinary agents have no access to them. Then check the prisons in other areas. Hearing William's words, Luo An frowned and said, "Several states around New York, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, you can check them." Okay. Hearing Luo An's words, William and the other 4 technical agents twitched their mouths, but still lowered their heads and got busy. Seeing William and the others start to work, Luo An looked at Reed again, tilted his head and asked, "Reed, what did you want to say just now?" "Nothing." Seeing that everyone was busy, Reed swallowed the words in his mouth, then grinned and patted Luo An on the shoulder. "I want to invite you to my house for dinner after get off work today." "Okay." Hearing this, Luo An's mouth corners rose, and he immediately nodded and agreed. "Someone invited me to dinner last night, and there is also one tonight." Luo An's mouth corners rose, and he cast his eyes on Mona. "Do you want to go to her house for a meal the day after tomorrow?" Mona shuddered, feeling as if something bad was staring at her. Time slowly moved forward, and the keyboard sound in the office area kept ringing, but the detectives of the number 5 investigation team did not find the Kevin in the portrait. In the process, William and others did find a few people who looked very similar to the person in the portrait. But after a careful investigation, either there was a witness to prove that the person was with him when the bank robbery occurred, or the person was no longer in New York and had no ability and time to commit the crime. Taking a big sip of the coffee beside her, Mona rubbed her sore fingers and tilted her head to look at Luo An. "Is there a possibility that the 2 women remembered Kevin's appearance wrong? Or the portrait artist made a mistake? It's not impossible, but..." Luo An touched his chin, pondered for a long time, took out his mobile phone, dialed the number and called Norton. "Luo An?" The voice on the other end of the phone was a little noisy, and it was obvious that Norton was not in the FBI building. "Good afternoon, Norton." Luo An simply greeted him, without any nonsense, and directly told the other party that he couldn't find anyone now. Simple. Hearing Luo An's question, Norton on the other end of the phone smiled slightly and said directly, "Send the simulated portrait to our organized crime investigation department now. As long as the portrait is accurate and the difference between it and the real person is not too big, I can find this person for you soon." Norton waved his hand. Their organized crime investigation department has special connections with most of the gangs in New York. They have done this kind of thing many times, and it is nothing to them. Of course, not everyone can ask the organized crime investigation department for help. If they are not familiar with them, the organized crime investigation department will ignore them. "Thank you, Norton." "You're welcome." Norton laughed, and after making an appointment with Roan to go fishing together on the weekend, he hung up the phone. "I'll go." After hanging up the phone, without waiting for Roan to say anything, Reed on the side, picked up the portrait, smiled at Roan, and strode away from the number 5 investigation team. It is unknown what method the organized crime investigation department used. Just 3 hours later, Reed returned to the number 5 investigation team and brought back a piece of paper with the rough information of the person in the simulated portrait, Fletcher Walker, 29 years old, living in Queens. After retrieving all the information about Fletcher according to the information, Mona was speechless and spread her hands. "No wonder we can't find him. This man was a Boy Scout 2 months ago." Hearing this, Roan was stunned. "What do you mean?" Chapter 102 Bringing Fletcher Walker Back to Headquarters. The meaning is very simple. Mona's hands flew over the keyboard, looking at the information in the computer and reading. Fletcher Walker, no record of drunk driving, no record of fighting, no criminal record. He was one of the most popular boys in school during his school years and had served as a quarterback. He attended the most ordinary community college in college and married his wife after graduation and worked at the New York docks. By the way, his wife was the girlfriend he dated when he was a quarterback in high school. That was also Fletcher's first and last girlfriend. The two have a very good relationship. The neighbors have never heard them quarreling, and the couple goes to a nearby church to volunteer every weekend. After listening to Mona's narration, Roan scratched his head, and Reed on the side was surprised. "No wonder you said this guy's a Boy Scout." Lassie looked at the information in the computer carefully and nodded with admiration. "This kind of man is really rare." The atmosphere of most ordinary community colleges in the United States. "So, why did this Fletcher go to the strip club?" Luo An touched his chin, pondered for a moment, tilted his head and asked, "If Fletcher's appearance is not a disguise, then is there something wrong with Fletcher's family?" "Now I can't judge whether Fletcher's appearance is fake or not. Mona tilted her head and gave Luo An a look, pointing to the information in the computer with a serious face and said, according to the information, 4 months ago, Fletcher's wife was in a car accident on the way home from get off work and died on the spot. According to Fletcher's wife's relatives and friends, at the funeral, Fletcher did not cry or feel sad and entertained these people very calmly. Because of this incident, Fletcher was slapped by his wife's sister, and Fletcher's relatives and friends also said that they had made a mistake. Hearing this, Ryder frowned, Lassie cursed inwardly, and Roan was thoughtful. Is there a possibility? So, are we going to arrest this hypocrite next? Lassie looked up and cast her eyes on Roan. Mona continued to type. After the funeral, Fletcher was fired by the New York docks, but he still has mortgage and car loans to pay every month. According to the surveillance video outside the community where Fletcher lives, before the first 4 bank robberies occurred, Fletcher left home with a bag. After all 4 robberies occurred, Fletcher returned home with the bag. Hearing this, Lassie and Ryder could no longer sit still, and they all cast their eyes on Roan. Okay, let's go and talk to Mr. Fletcher now. Seeing the eyes of his teammates, Roan stood up with a smile and went to the equipment warehouse with Ryder, who strongly requested to go on the mission together. Lassie stayed with the number 5 investigation team this time. The dark SUV was speeding through the traffic on the road. Ryder grinned as he watched the scene outside the car speeding away. However, after a few seconds of laughing, he saw that the speed of the car seemed to have increased again. The corner of Ryder's mouth twitched. After a long silence, he tilted his head and whispered, Roan, we don't need to be so anxious. Mona just told me that the community's surveillance video showed that Fletcher had not left the house for a week. He is very likely to stay in the house now. I also know the news you mentioned. Hearing Ryder's words, Roan smiled and shook his head, and at the same time, stepped on the accelerator to let the SUV overtake the small book in front. Do you think I look anxious? Ryder. As Ryder silently tightened the seatbelt, the dark SUV quickly left Manhattan and rushed to Queens where Fletcher was. Fred lived in a 2-story single-family apartment with a small lawn in front and a small lawn in the back. After slowly parking the SUV on the side of the road, they got out of the car and saw that the house in front of them had 2 doors, the front and the back. The two looked at each other, and Riyad decisively turned and walked towards the back door of the house. After confirming that Riyad was already standing at the back door of the villa with the Glock 18 in his hand, Luo An did not hesitate, put on the SUV helmet, picked up the Glock 18, and strode towards the front door of the house. Bang, bang, bang. Luo An stood at the side of the door, patted the front door of the house hard, and shouted loudly, Is anyone home? The house was quiet, as if no one was there. Luo An. Just as Luo An was about to knock on the door a few more times, Riyad suddenly came over. Huh. Seeing the doubt on Luo An's face, Riyad shrugged, pointed to the second floor of the house and whispered, There is a triangular ladder behind the house. I just tried to climb up and took a look. There is a man who seems to be unconscious in the bedroom on the 2nd floor. Okay. Hearing Riyad's words, Luo An no longer hesitated and kicked the door. FBI. The door was kicked and smashed. Roan held a Glock 18 in a fighting posture, shouting slogans while checking every room in the house at the fastest speed. Ryder had just returned to the back door. After Roan took action, he also began to check each room quickly. Safe. Safe. After making sure that every room in the house was checked and there was no danger, Roan and Ryder came to the door of the bedroom on the 2nd floor. They looked at each other, counted down to 3, then stood up at the same time and rushed in with Glock 18. In the bedroom, a bald white man with a bit of muscle outline was lying naked on the big bed. Even though Roan and Ryder kicked the door open and broke in, the bald white man did not move. If he hadn't seen the other person's belly rising and falling, Roan would have thought he was dead. Roan carefully looked at the bald white man's big face and confirmed that he was indeed looking for Fletcher. In front of the bedside table in the bedroom, there was a small bag of white flour. Ryder's mouth twitched when he saw this. He didn't touch it with his hands, but just called Roan and pointed it out to Roan. I understand. Seeing the bag of white flour, Roan nodded calmly, then stretched out his hand and slapped Fletcher's face hard. Snap, snap, snap. The clear and loud slapping sound echoed throughout the bedroom, and Ryder's mouth twitched when he heard it. It seemed that Evan slapped him in the same way yesterday. The violent wake-up service was very effective, and Fletcher woke up quickly. Seeing Roan's unfamiliar handsome face, Fletcher rubbed his eyes and asked vaguely, "Who are you? Why are you in my house?" "We are the FBI." Roan laughed and shook the Glock 18 in front of Fletcher. "Of course I came to your house to find you for something." "FBI?" Hearing Roan's words, Fletcher trembled all over, his eyes widened instantly, and he decisively got up and left the big bed and ran out of the bedroom. Then, his legs went weak, and he collapsed to the ground. Seeing Fletcher struggling to crawl on the floor of the bedroom, Roan and Ryder both shook their heads speechlessly. After the effect of white flour wore off, people would be very tired. But Fletcher, who was so tired that he had difficulty walking. "You ate a lot of flour this time." Roan asked Ryder to take Fletcher into the SUV and began to search the house. Roan searched the living room, kitchen, and basement, and looked at the floor carefully, but did not find the US dollars he imagined. After a few seconds of hesitation, Roan returned to the bedroom and began to look around again. He did not find anything useful in the closet and under the bed, but under the TV cabinet, Roan successfully found a few notebooks. He opened a notebook casually, and Roan, who was originally indifferent, saw the contents inside, and his pupils shrank instantly. "Roan." Hearing Ryder calling him, Roan did not hesitate, and immediately picked up the notebooks and returned to the SUV. Ryder was sitting in the back seat, holding tightly onto Fletcher, who was beginning to get confused again. When he saw Roan bringing back a few notebooks, he immediately looked puzzled. "What are these?" "You'll know soon." Roan's face was serious, and he stepped on the accelerator to the bottom. The black SUV rushed out like lightning. Chapter 103 Notebook. 4 hours later, in the interrogation room of the 5th investigation team, Fletcher was handcuffed to a chair, his body trembling and yawning. Fletcher, Roan and Lassie walked into the interrogation room with a bunch of things. After they sat down, Lassie stared at Fletcher and told the time of the 4 robberies one by one, and then asked, "Where were you at these 4 time points?" Fletcher rolled his eyes a few times and replied in a low voice, "I was on a business trip." "Really?" Hearing this, Lassie curled her lips in disdain, took out the notebook that Roan had just brought back from her side, opened it, showed the contents to Fletcher, and said coldly, "Fletcher, we don't have time to talk nonsense with you. You'd better tell the truth quickly. The words written in this notebook are exactly the same as what the 2 robbers did in the 4 bank robberies. And we also know that you were fired from the New York docks. Your so-called business trip. Haha, what's going on?" That's right, in a notebook that Roan found in Fletcher's bedroom, several pages were filled with the various steps of the previous 4 robberies. In the early stage of investigation, he used a reporter to scout the location and how to avoid the camera after robbing the bank so that the police could not find his shadow. How to deceive the police: stick to 2 stickers on some easily exposed parts of the body and let the witnesses at the scene see it inadvertently. In short, the contents of the notebook include the entire plan of robbing the bank, as well as most of the problems that may be encountered during the bank robbery, and specific solutions. From Luo An's point of view, these words in the notebook, except for not writing how to launder money after robbing the bank, and a few minor flaws. The rest, as long as you act according to the contents of the notebook, the chance of success in robbing the bank is very high. What did you say? After hearing Lassie's words, and then seeing the notebook in front of him, Fletcher's eyes bulged out in an instant, and he became energetic in an instant, shouting loudly, "It's not me. It's really not me. This is just a script." "Script?" Luo An and Lassie were stunned when they heard this. "Yes, it's a script." Seeing the expressions on the faces of the 2 people opposite him, Fletcher licked his chapped lips and began to narrate at a fast speed. 2 months ago, my wife had a car accident. Fletcher said that he should have burst into tears after his beloved wife died in a car accident. But for some reason, Fletcher just couldn't cry. He continued to live his life as if his wife had never appeared. After woodenly handling his wife's body and inviting relatives and friends to the funeral, Fletcher felt like an outsider, and all this had nothing to do with him. Until he was slapped by his wife's sister. That day I drove home with my face covered. Fletcher's body was shaking, his hands covering his cheeks with tears streaming down his face. The moment I lay on the bed, my tears suddenly flowed down, and I couldn't stop them no matter what. Hearing Fletcher's narration, Lassie frowned slightly and tilted her head to look at Roan. Seeing this, Roan was silent for a few seconds and explained in a low voice, "It is a kind of emergency defense mechanism of human beings. When faced with a catastrophic event that suddenly befalls them and they are completely powerless to change it, some people's brains will block this matter as if it never happened and let themselves move forward. This kind of thing is very common. For those with milder cases, such as girls who were molested as children, or like Fletcher, who suddenly encountered the death of relatives, they will subconsciously ignore the catastrophic event until they suddenly remember it in the future. For more serious cases, it is schizophrenia. The victim imagines a person in his head to bear the suffering for him, and he forgets these things and moves on." Roan had this idea when Mona pointed to the computer and described the situation before, but there was no evidence at the time. Lassie frowned, nodded, turned to look at Fletcher, and without changing her tone, patted the notebook on the table, and continued to ask, "What does this have to do with the script you mentioned?" Fletcher wiped his tears and continued to narrate. After crying all night, Fletcher learned the news that he was fired from the New York dock the next day. After being silent for a whole day, Fletcher chose to put the matter of dismissal aside. He had more important things to do next. "When my wife was still alive, she once told me that, because of marrying me, she lost the opportunity to realize her dream." Fletcher stroked the mark of the ring on his finger, with a look of reminiscence on his face. Because of her family, his wife has been a devout Christian since she was a child. As a good girl who believes in God, she has never had a tattoo, never stolen other women's things, never smoked leaves, never eaten flour, never been to a strip club, never too much. Not only that, his wife has always had a dream, that is, to become a screenwriter, so that the story she writes can appear on the big screen in Hollywood. So, for the rest of my life, I will realize the dreams my wife told me when she was alive. The content in the notebook is one of the stories Fletcher wrote to realize his wife's dream of becoming a screenwriter. Thinking of Fletcher's personality and experience in the first half of his life introduced by Mona, Roan and Lassie frowned and believed it halfway. Because Fletcher still didn't say where he was when the 4 bank robberies happened. Seeing Roan and Lassie still sitting in the chair, looking at him quietly, Fletcher was silent for a while, and finally sighed. "When the 4 robberies happened, I went to New Jersey and bought some leaves and flour from the Hyena Gang. The flour you just saw in the bedroom was bought from the Hyena Gang. I only bought a small bag at the time. I thought it would be okay to eat it once, but I didn't expect to buy more and more later." Hearing this, Roan raised his eyebrows. No wonder Fletcher collapsed to the ground just now. It turned out that the flour was bought from the Hyena Gang. The flour in the Hyena Gang was all added with fentanyl. The toxicity and addictiveness of fentanyl. After listening to Fletcher's narration, the two discussed for a while, and Lassie stood up and left the interrogation room. Fletcher said that he had been living in a hotel in New Jersey for those days because he was afraid that the police would find him in possession of flour on the road. She was going to check the surveillance and witnesses of that hotel now. "Very good, Mr. Fletcher. Let's assume that what you just said is true." Looking away from the door of the interrogation room that Lassie had closed, Roan turned his attention back to Fletcher and said with a serious expression, "But the text in your notebook is exactly the same as that in the 4 robberies, which means that the robbers must have contacted you. It may even be your relatives and friends. I now hope you think carefully. Besides you, who else has read the contents of the notebook?" "That's too much, Mr. Agent." Fletcher smiled bitterly, indicating that in the past 4 months, he had sought help from many relatives and friends for inspiration. Although some people felt that they had misjudged Fletcher and ignored him, but some people chose to believe Fletcher. After knowing and helping each other for many years, they did not believe that Fletcher was the kind of indifferent person. Luo An frowned, and after a few seconds of silence, he continued to ask, "Among these people, which ones have served in the army? Are there any police officers? Or joined special departments such as SWAT?" This Fletcher lowered his head and frowned to think for a long time, then shook his head. It seems not, Mr. Agent. Luo An raised his eyebrows when he heard this, and just as he was about to speak, Fletcher suddenly clapped his arms, looked up and said, "By the way, Mr. Agent, I remembered something. Chapter 104, Some Discomfort Behind." "What's the matter?" Hearing Fletcher's words, Luo An asked hurriedly. "The story in the notebook is almost finished. When I was walking back from my friend's house, my car had some problems on the way." Fletcher rubbed his eyes and explained, "I sent the car to a repair shop at that time, and I accidentally left this notebook in the car that night. If I'm not mistaken, the employees of the repair shop probably read the notebook." "Okay." Luo An's eyelids moved slightly, and he was silent for a few seconds and nodded slowly, and then continued to ask for other information. But because of the flour, Fletcher's mind was not very clear, and he even dozed off in the chair later. Luo An frowned when he saw this, so he stopped asking questions and left the interrogation room to let William take Fletcher away from here and temporarily detain him. Returning to his workstation, Roan looked at Fletcher's notebook for a long time, then tilted his head to look at Mona. "How long has Lassie been away?" "About half an hour." Mona looked at the clock at the front of the office area of the number 5 investigation team and said, "I saw her come out of the interrogation room and went directly to the equipment warehouse." Roan nodded and saw Mona's fingers flying on the keyboard and tilted his head to ask, "What are you checking?" "August asked me to check the information and itinerary of several NYPD who have reviewed the bank robbery case files." Mona shrugged and explained, "August thinks the first 4 cases may be related to the NYPD. Roan's eyebrows twitched when he heard this and asked, "Did Augustus find any information related to the robbers?" "Probably not." Mona shook her head slowly. "Augustus didn't say much to her, but just asked her to check it first." "Okay." Seeing Luo An's hesitation, Mona raised her lips and asked softly, "Why? Is there anything I can help you with?" "Indeed." Luo An nodded and said directly, "In the 5th and 6th cases, the 2 robbers planned to use a prostitute to scout the bank. Fletcher's notebook just now also wrote about using a prostitute to scout the bank. I think there is definitely a connection between them, but I don't know where the connection is. However, this matter can be put aside for later. I now hope that you can check the women in the surveillance footage of the previous 4 cases and the previous 2 days to see if their identities and jobs are related to similar professions such as prostitutes. If there is a connection between their professions, they may also be related to the previous 4 robberies, or even they may be the scouts sent to the bank by the robbers of the previous 4 robberies." "No problem. Leave it to me." After hearing this, Mona nodded decisively and agreed. Seeing Luo An's face was a little surprised, she smiled slightly. "Augustus said he is not in a hurry and can finish the investigation within 3 days. Luo An suddenly realized and patted Mona on the shoulder. "Thank you for your hard work." Mona waved her hand, indicating that it was a small matter, and picked up the phone to call those banks. Most of the surveillance videos of American banks are kept for about 3 months. So more than an hour later, Mona got the surveillance videos of the bank all 4 days before the 4 robberies. Luo An sat down on the chair at his workstation and was about to check the video with Mona when the phone suddenly rang. "It's me, Lassie." There was a faint noise from the other end of the phone, and Lassie's voice was a little tired. "I just checked the hotel." Fletcher didn't lie. He was indeed here when the crime happened. "Okay." Luo An smacked his lips, and when he heard that Lassie's condition was not right on the other end of the phone, he immediately asked with a serious face, "What happened to you? Do you need to call for support?" "No." Lassie's voice of rejection came from the other end of the phone, and then explained, "When I came here, the owner of this hotel was arrested by the New Jersey police for planting leaves on the roof and balcony. I just tried hard to convince the New Jersey police to let me interrogate the hotel owner and check the hotel's surveillance." "Thank you for your hard work." Hearing Lassie's solemn assurance that she could solve these small problems, Luo An's mouth twitched and hung up the phone. Mainly because Luo An heard the voice of the New Jersey police on the other end of the phone, he judged that the other party was most likely a female police officer. Soon, it was time to get off work today. After confirming Fletcher's condition with William, Roan left the office like everyone else. First drove his Chevrolet to a nearby supermarket to buy a few bottles of red wine, and then slowly headed to Riyadh's house. An unusually sumptuous barbecue dinner. The next day, Jacob Federal Building. Roan walked out of the bathroom, looked at his haggard face in the mirror, and then felt a little uncomfortable, and his mouth twitched. No, I have to eat more vegetables and fruits later. In this case, drinking the new physical potion that the system opened at 12 o'clock last night is useless. The detoxification potion may be useful, but Roan doesn't want to use the detoxification potion, which can save lives at critical moments, for such things. Good morning, Roan. Back in the office area of the number 5 investigation team, Riyadh waved to Roan with a smile on his face. Roan grinned and nodded reluctantly. Lassie and Mona were also there. They were sitting together at this time, discussing the cosmetics in the computer with excited expressions. Good morning, everyone. The familiar opening remarks and loud voice sounded at the door of the number 5 investigation team's office area, and Augustus, with a big belly, walked in with a bag of breakfast. Without any nonsense, Augustus stood at the front of the office area, looked directly at William, and said, "William, tell us about yesterday's investigation." "Let me do it." As soon as William stood up, Luo An waved his hand to indicate to him that he would take care of this matter today. "Everyone, yesterday we caught a former Boy Scout, Fletcher." William sat back down. Roan took a deep breath and started to introduce to everyone with the notebook in his hand. "Based on what Fletcher told us, we have roughly figured out the circumstances of the 4 robberies. 4 months ago, Fletcher's wife died. 3 months ago, Fletcher decided to spend the rest of his life fulfilling his wife's unfinished dream. Not long after, the script for the bank robbery appeared. Many people have read this script, not only Fletcher's relatives and friends, but according to Fletcher, employees in a certain auto repair shop may have also read it. And last month, the first bank robbery took place, and the robbers' actions were exactly the same as described in the script. Therefore, we can judge that this group of robbers must have read the script written by Fletcher." "Good." Augustus nodded with satisfaction and motioned for Roan to continue. Roan walked to the front of the office area of the number 5 investigation team, pulled over a whiteboard, and wrote as he spoke, "Next, we have 3 directions for investigation. First, carefully check Fletcher's relatives and friends who have reviewed the script, focusing on those who have military experience. Second, go to the auto repair shop that Fletcher mentioned, and make sure whether there are really people there who have seen the notebook, and if so, who are they? Third, check the surveillance video of the 4 days before the bank robbery." "Very good." After listening to Roan's narration, Augustus waved his hand, signaling the technicians of the number 5 investigation team to immediately check the personnel, and then tilted his head to look at several field agents, who will go to the auto repair shop. "Let Lassie and Ryder go." Feeling the discomfort coming from behind, Roan's mouth twitched. Fletcher's mind was not clear yesterday, and there are still many things I haven't asked. I will go to interrogate him later. "Okay." Augustus nodded, and Lassie and Ryder didn't say anything. They got up and went to the equipment warehouse together. Half an hour later, Fletcher was locked up in the interrogation room again. Chapter 105 Amazing Discovery. In the interrogation room, Fletcher was listless, but his mind seemed to be much better than yesterday. After entering the interrogation room, Mona took her laptop and sat on the chair opposite Fletcher, while Roan threw the folder on the table and stood beside them. "Good morning." Seeing Mona's puzzled look, Roan's eyelids jumped, pretending not to see it, and then tilted his head to look at Fletcher. "Would you like a cup of coffee?" "No, thank you." Fletcher shook his head with a stiff face, and after hearing Roan's words, he asked in doubt, "I told you everything about what happened yesterday. Why are you still looking for me?" "No, Fletcher, you still have a lot of things to explain to us." Seeing that Fletcher refused to drink their bitter coffee without knowing it, Roan raised his eyebrows and said, "I need you to tell us all your experiences after writing this script." Fletcher's mental state yesterday was not very good, and what he said was just an overview. Roan needed to know more details. Not only is the devil hidden in the details, but the robbers of bank robberies may also be the same. "What?" Hearing Roan's words, Fletcher's scalp tightened and he shouted, "How is this possible? That was so long ago. How can I remember what happened every day?" Not every day. Roan shook his head and crossed his hands on his chest. He said that he knew Fletcher's memory could not be so good, so Fletcher just needed to explain who he met and what he did in the process of writing this story. This is impossible. Fletcher still shook his head. Seeing this, Roan lowered his mouth and said coldly, "Fletcher, don't forget about the flower. I'm not forcing you, but helping you get the opportunity to ask for a reduction in sentence in front of the judge." Hearing Roan's words, Fletcher was stunned for a moment. After a long silence, he sighed and finally raised his head and asked in a low voice, "I will recall those things carefully, but before that, can you give me a cup of coffee?" "No problem." Roan heard the words, grinned, waved his hand to signal Mona not to move, turned around and left the interrogation room, and personally poured a cup of coffee for Fletcher. "Thank you." Seeing the coffee in front of him, Fletcher politely said thank you, and then, puff, the bitter feeling suddenly exploded on the tip of his tongue. Fletcher's eyes widened, and he instantly spit out the coffee in his mouth. "You're refreshed now." Seeing Fletcher's face flushed instantly, Roan, who successfully avoided the coffee in his mouth, smiled slightly, put the folder in front of Mona, and then turned on the recorder, indicating that Fletcher could start narrating. Mona. Fletcher, who was several times more refreshed than before, glared at Roan fiercely, was silent for a while, closed his eyes, and began to speak slowly. "When I had the dream of fulfilling my wife's dream for the rest of my life, the first person I went to look for was..." Fletcher's unhurried narration sounded in the interrogation room. More than half an hour later, Roan's mobile phone suddenly rang. "You continue." Seeing Fletcher was interrupted by the ringing of the phone, Roan waved his hand to signal him to continue, and turned around and left the interrogation room. "It's me, Lassie." Lassie's voice on the other end of the phone was helpless. After answering the call, she said, "Roan, I have good news and bad news here. Which one do you want to hear first?" Roan's brows trembled when he heard this, and said, "Let's talk about the bad news first." The bad news is that after Iad's unique interrogation skills, we learned one thing. In the two-story repair shop manager's office, Lassie looked at the busy employees below and said speechlessly, "The employees of this repair shop will indeed not take the money left by the owner in the car, but they have done everything else, including but not limited to stealing 1 or 2 cigarettes, stealing 1 or 2 pieces of pizza. Of course, it also includes secretly looking through other people's notebooks. So all the employees in this repair shop know the story recorded in Fred's notebook. There is even a boy who comes here part-time and said that the story is good and it would be even better if it could be made into a movie." "Okay." Roan's face froze when he heard this. "What about the good news?" "The good news is that I know why one of the robbers, Delano, planned to use a journalist to scout the place without reading the script in the next 2 cases." Mona took the car repair records in the office, sighed and said, "Because after Delano was released from prison, he also came here to repair his car, and then he got this idea when chatting with the employees of this repair shop." "This doesn't seem to be good news." Luo An's mouth twitched, and he rubbed his eyebrows. After a long silence, he said, "So we don't know how many people have heard this story from the employees of the car wash, right?" Not really." Lassie shook the car repair records in her hand. "We can check the list of customers who have come here to repair their cars in the past 2 months." "Okay, you bring the list back." After hanging up the phone, Luo An felt that not only his back hurt, but also his head hurt a little. After re-entering the interrogation room, Roan briefly told Fletcher about the incident, and then spread his hands as Mona frowned. "It's a pity, Mr. Fletcher, if nothing unexpected happens, your story may not be made into a script, because too many people know about it. I can't tell if anyone has written this story into a script before you, and submitted it to a film company before you." After hearing Roan's words, Fletcher, who was originally very nervous, breathed a sigh of relief, then waved his hands and said nonchalantly, "It's okay, it's impossible. When this story was first written, I submitted it to Hollywood for registration. If someone writes a script identical to this story after me, it will only be considered plagiarism. And to be honest, as soon as I registered this story, a film company contacted me and wanted to buy the script. But the offer was only $500, which was too low, so I rejected it. Has a film company contacted you?" Hearing this news, Roan frowned even more. How many people know this story? How many people know the specific details of this story? However, the outside media have not written about this matter in the newspapers, which means that they have not discovered this. This is barely good news. After all, at this time, except for entertainment newspapers, the bosses of other newspapers in the New York area are very arrogant and most of the time they will not pay attention to Hollywood. For a moment, Mona frowned, and Roan was full of MMP. Taking a deep breath, Roan suppressed the complicated emotions in his heart and asked, "What is the name of that film company?" "Hollywood Golden Light Pictures." Fletcher curled his lips in disdain. He had never heard of this company. Seeing Roan's eyes, Mona nodded and began to investigate the situation of this film company with 10 fingers flying. "Okay." Roan stood in place, changed his posture, and just asked Fletcher a few words. Mona suddenly slapped the table. "Roan, come and see." "What's wrong?" Hearing Mona's words, Roan quickly moved to her side. Following Mona's direction, Roan cast his eyes on the laptop screen. Inside was a photo of the boss of Golden Light Pictures chatting with a man in a cafe. Chapter 106 The Real Robber. Henry Mitchell, the boss of Golden Light Pictures. According to the data, Golden Light Pictures was in a very bad financial situation 2 months ago, with more expenses than income, and it was only a matter of time before it closed down. Mona picked up the laptop and left the interrogation room with Luo An. After returning to her workstation, she tapped on the keyboard with her 10 fingers and explained, "But last month, Golden Light Pictures suddenly accepted a large amount of capital injection. Now this company not only has not closed down, but has started to prepare new movies." Luo An frowned when he heard this. "Who injected capital into this company? Can we find out? You know, there are a lot of shell companies, overseas companies, bad debts and other information in Hollywood. It is impossible for our number 5 investigation team to find out the source of this money." Mona shook her head. "Hollywood has always been a mess. In addition to the people in the circle who can guess the company's accounts based on past experience, even the group of people on Wall Street have been cheated by Hollywood. So, what you mean is..." Seeing Mona shaking her head and thinking of the photo she had just seen on the computer, Roan raised his eyebrows. "Is there something wrong with the man drinking coffee opposite Henry in the photo?" "Yes." Mona gave Roan a look of good reaction speed, and after tapping the keyboard a few times, she called up the other party's identity information. "The man sitting opposite Henry Mitchell is named Isaac Mitchell, 37 years old, and is Henry's half-brother. He has served in the military abroad for more than 10 years. At the beginning of this year, he just retired from a certain area abroad and returned to the Federation. His economic level is average and can only be considered middle class." At this point, Mona's mouth corners slightly raised, and after tapping the keyboard a few times, a plane ticket purchase record popped up. "Because of the other party's military experience, I just wanted to check if the other party had been to New York recently. What I didn't expect was that just a week before the first bank robbery, he actually flew to New York. Not only that, on the 3rd day after the 4th bank robbery, Isaac drove a newly bought pickup truck and left New York." After hearing what Mona said, Roan's eyes lit up instantly. "Flying to New York just to buy a pickup truck here?" Roan stood up, clapped his hands to attract the attention of the technicians of the number 5 investigation team, and then said loudly, "Everyone, we have found a new suspect now." After briefly describing Isaac's situation, Roan continued, "Next, we have to investigate all of Isaac's actions in New York. I hope everyone can find out where he went after getting off the plane, where he lived, what he bought, and everything else. I have a hunch that we are not far from finding this group of bank robbers." "No problem. Leave it to us." After hearing Roan's words, the technicians nodded decisively and agreed. The next second, the crackling sound of keyboards began to resound throughout the office area of the number 5 investigation team. Seeing this, Roan's mouth curled slightly and then turned to August's office. "Dang. Dang." After knocking on the door a few times, Roan heard August's voice and pushed the door open. But as soon as he entered the office, Roan found that August's face didn't seem very good. The phone was thrown on the table, obviously just hung up, and Augustus's face turned pale with anger. "Sorry, sir. Luo An frowned and asked in a low voice, "How about I come back later?" "No need." Augustus took a deep breath, looked at Luo An calmly, and asked, "Did you find any important clues?" "Yes." Luo An nodded, briefly recounted the matter of golden light pictures, and finally explained, "I now suspect that the person who injected capital into golden light pictures is most likely Isaac. But because the companies and accounts in Hollywood are not clear to ordinary people, and no one in our number 5 investigation team understands these, so although Luo An Greenwood studied accounting, he was almost forgetting all the knowledge at this time. If he relied on him to check the accounts, Luo An felt that he might have to go back to college to attend classes first. Okay. After listening to Roan's narration, Augustus understood what he meant, so he agreed decisively. "You go check on Isaac. I will solve the issue of the source of investment for golden light pictures." "Okay, sir." Hearing Augustus's firm agreement without hesitation, Roma's eyebrows raised. Could it be that he has connections in the eyes? Turning around and leaving the team leader's office, more than an hour later, with the efforts of everyone in the number 5 investigation team, Isaac's itinerary in New York was successfully checked. According to the airport surveillance video, after getting off the plane, Isaac took a taxi and went straight to Brooklyn. William bent down to look at the screen on the computer and introduced, "According to the surveillance video, I contacted the taxi driver." The other party recalled carefully and remembered that the place Isaac went to was a small community in the upper city of Brooklyn. The driver did not know which family in the community Isaac went to after getting off the car. In addition to the surveillance videos at the gates around the small community, the interior of the community was completely dark. However, when I was looking up the information of the residents in this community, I found a comrade in arms who fought with Isaac in a certain area abroad. Mona continued with William's information. "This man's name is Hawkey Garsha. He is white, 39 years old, and returned to the Federation a year earlier than Isaac. He has no family, is an alcoholic and likes gambling, and his economic level is very poor." "Good. Isaac and Hawkey are both white and have military experience. They are exactly the same as the robbers in the first 4 robberies." Roan nodded and continued to ask, "Is there any other information?" William continued, "When the 4 robberies occurred, the community surveillance did not find any signs of the 2 leaving or entering the community." Roan's expression did not change. After all, these 2 people came back alive from the battlefield, and avoiding surveillance was nothing to them. "One more thing." Mona tapped her 10 fingers on the keyboard, then looked up and said, "This community is located just to the east of the bank robbery, and the mother of a female employee in the first bank robbery lives in this community." Luo An's eyelids twitched when he heard this, and he tilted his head and asked, "Where is this Hawkey now?" "He has left New York." Mona shrugged, pointed to the information in the computer and said, "Like Isaac, Hawkey also bought a pickup truck and drove away from New York on the 3rd day after the 4th bank robbery. The latest consumption records show that Hawkey is in California, driving a yacht, and enjoying the sunbathing. The only drawback is that there seems to be no beauties on this yacht." "Shit. Fouquet. Damn it." Hearing this, all the technicians in the number 5 investigation team cursed in a low voice. Augustus, who left the team leader's office and discussed the situation with everyone, rested his chin on his hand and frowned. "In this situation, we can roughly judge that Isaac and Hawkey are the real robbers of the previous 4 robberies. But the accounts of golden light pictures cannot be checked in a short time. The information you mentioned are all indirect clues. We have to find a way to find direct clues." Hearing Augustus' words, the technicians of the number 5 investigation team frowned. "We can check the house that Hawkey rented some time ago, and the warehouse he rented." Luo An laughed, attracting everyone's attention. He pointed to the information in the computer and said, "These 2 places have not been rented out. We can go here to search, and maybe find some useful clues." Ryder and Lassie were still on their way back, so Luo An chatted with the agents for a few words, and took Mona to the equipment warehouse. On the way, Mona, who was sitting in the passenger seat and looking down at the surveillance video of the bank robbery a few days ago, felt the sub moving forward steadily at an average speed, and her face was full of suspicion. "What happened to Luo An today?" "We are here." The black sub slowly stopped on the road diagonally opposite the community. This time, the operation to investigate Hoki's house could not be judged whether anyone would tell Hoki about this matter afterwards. So in order not to alert the enemy, Luo An and Mona only brought the FBI equipment into the car this time and did not wear it on their bodies. The two were wearing ordinary clothes at this time and pretended to be an ordinary couple looking for a house. But they still had to bring a pistol. After carefully checking the Glock 18 and the corresponding extended magazine, Luo An smiled slightly and then opened the car door and got out of the car. Chapter 107 Resolving Witness Issues. Mona, who watched the whole process, rubbed her forehead speechlessly, paused the surveillance video on the computer, then opened the car door and got out of the car. Luo An, I think you can go and talk to a psychologist when you have time in the future. The two crossed the road and walked straight to the small community. Mona walked to Luo An and whispered, if you are worried that seeing a psychologist within the FBI will make your superiors worry about your mental state and affect your future, I can introduce you to a psychologist you can absolutely trust. She is a very good person and has a high level of professionalism. I'm not lying to you. When I was a child, she really helped me a lot. Luo An felt very happy to hear Mona bring up her childhood experiences as an example to show that she did not lie to him. At least it shows that Mona is really doing it for his own good and really wants to help him. But, Mona, I really don't have any psychological problems. Luo An shook his head speechlessly. I'm just a little worried about the lack of firepower. Pay attention to details, want to defeat the enemy as soon as possible, and try not to hurt myself and my teammates. It's best to nip the danger in the bud. Can these be considered psychological problems? Mona heard this, and the corners of her mouth twitched slightly. This doesn't count? Aren't these manifestations of lack of security? Of course not. Luo An waved his hand. This is called paying attention to your own life and being responsible for your own life safety. Without waiting for Mona to continue speaking, Luo An had already taken her to the Self-Management Community Association in the community. America is a free country, and the different rules brought about by the gap between the rich and the poor are vividly reflected in various areas of daily life. Just like the security problem of the community. In the rich area, there are security guards, and the police patrol on time. In the high-end community, there are fewer security guards and fewer police patrols, but at least they are still there. In ordinary communities, most of them have no security, and the police only pass by occasionally when patrolling. Residents living in such communities usually get together and form a self-management association to help each other. As for the remaining garbage communities, I can only say that America is a free country where people are free to live and die. Hello, my name is Martin, and her name is Catherine. After a simple inquiry, Roan found the person on duty for this community self-management association. A white old man who is definitely no less than 50 years old. After briefly introducing himself and Mona's name, Roan showed the white old man a sunny smile. I heard that there are houses for rent in this community. Can you take us to have a look? Rent a house? Which one? Hearing Roan's words, the white old man Eric looked up and asked without thinking too much. Sometimes, the Community Self-Management Association will also assume some intermediary responsibilities. When the landlord has something to do and is away from home, they will help the landlord to receive the tenants and collect some hard work fees afterwards. But there is also a premise here, that is, the association can only receive and cannot directly sign a contract with the tenant. The contract must be signed by the landlord and the tenant. Unless the landlord allows and gives someone in the association the right. Luo An told him the room number that Hawkeye had rented some time ago. The white old man Eric flipped through the thick notebook and nodded after a long time. Yes, this room has not been rented out yet. I can take you to see it now. Thank you. Seeing the warm smile on Luo An's face, Eric felt very happy. When they went up the stairs to chat, Luo An used some words to flatter Eric so much that he almost couldn't close his mouth. So when Luo An entered the room and carefully observed the specific situation in the room, Eric, who was waiting at the door, pondered for a long time and finally walked to Luo An and said earnestly, how about this, kids, how about you rent another room? This room may not be suitable for you. Seeing the puzzled expressions on Luo An and Mona's faces, Eric was silent for a while and waved his hand. to signal Luo An to bow his head. The previous tenant of this room was a gay man. I saw him come back here with other men. Luo An, who knew that the previous tenant of this room was Hawkeye, fell silent after hearing Eric's words. The next second, Luo An suddenly remembered something. His pupils suddenly shrank, and he asked in a low voice, "Eric, is there a bar near this community where people like them would go?" "Indeed there is one, not far from here." Eric nodded, and seeing the change in Luo An's expression, he thought he was shocked by his words. Just as he was about to say something more, Luo An stretched out his hand and shook hands with him. "Thank you, Eric. Thank you very much for the news." "You're welcome." Eric shook his head and was about to say something else. Luo An expressed his gratitude again, then took Mona's hand and ran away quickly. "Roan, what happened?" Mona looked confused, not understanding why Roan was so anxious. "Aren't we going to check the warehouse that Hawkeye rented?" "No need. I just found that the room that Hawkeye rented was cleaned very carefully, without even a hair left. It is obvious that Isaac and Hawkeye handled the scene carefully." Roan shook his head. "In this case, the warehouse that Hawkeye rented was probably also cleaned carefully by the two." "Okay." Mona nodded after hearing this, and then asked, "Where are we going next?" The two had already run back to the SUV. What Eric said just now inspired me, and it also reminded me of a problem that we all ignored before. Seeing the questioning look on Mona's face, Luo An said solemnly, "We always thought that the people who went to the bank to scout before the incident were most likely women, but why couldn't they be men?" Men. Hearing this unique word, Mona was stunned at first, and then suddenly slapped her head. "That's right. Eric just said that Hawkeye is a gay." After reacting, Mona immediately cast her eyes on the computer, her 10 fingers dancing on the keyboard, and began to check the men who appeared in the surveillance videos before the previous 4 robberies. Luo An did not sit aside and wait, but stepped on the accelerator of the SUV and drove towards the bar that Eric had just mentioned. The bar was not too far from the community, only a few blocks away. After arriving, Luo An and Mona got out of the car together and pushed the door to go in. "Excuse me, ma'am." The door was just halfway open when a sturdy black security guard came out and held out his hand to stop Mona. "This may not be suitable for women to enter." Seeing this, Mona did not waste any words and directly took out the FBI's golden badge and said coldly, "FBI." The black security guard was stunned and then silently made way. "Don't just stand there." Luo An patted the black man's arm and grinned. "Take us to see your boss." The black security guard wanted to say something, but when he saw Luo An also took out the golden badge, he smacked his lips, turned around and opened the door to the inner room, and took the two to the manager's office behind the bar. Following the black security guard, Mona looked around expressionlessly and found that the gay bar didn't seem to be anything special, and the decoration was similar to that of an ordinary bar. Just when she was about to say something to Luo An, she suddenly found that Luo An grinned, left her, and walked to the side of the bar. "Hello." Roan walked to a white man with short hair, greeted him and smiled. "I think you look familiar. Come on." Hearing Roan's words, Chad rolled his eyes. "Your chat talk is too old-fashioned." "No, I'm not chatting you up again. I'm telling you a story." Roan shook his head. Mona, who was standing next to him, saw Chad's face clearly. Her pupils tightened, and she also walked to the bar silently. Before Chad could wonder why a woman came here, Roan took out the FBI's golden badge and grinned. "Did you go to a bank to handle business last month?" Seeing Roan's actions and hearing Roan's words, Chad's body stiffened instantly, and sweat appeared on his forehead in an instant. The next second, Chad threw the wine glass on the bar towards Roan, and turned around and ran. The moment the wine glass was thrown by Chad, Roan dodged to the left, took advantage of the momentum to raise his right foot, and kicked Chad's back hard. Bang! The next second, in front of everyone's astonished eyes, Chad flew out, smashed a few tables, and landed heavily on the floor of the bar. Hiss, WTF. Holy crap. Seeing Chad lying on the ground, twitching his legs, and then being motionless, the whole bar was filled with gasps, and everyone looked at Luo An, as if they had seen a ghost. Mona also looked at Luo An in amazement. When did he become so strong? After they came back to their senses, several men looked at Luo An's eyes, which suddenly lit up. Luo An. 3 hours later, in the office area of the 5th investigation team, Chad has confessed and agreed to testify in court. We now have a witness. Amid everyone's surprised gazes, Ronan Mona walked out of the interrogation room with a smile and distributed Chad's confession to everyone. Chad admitted that he helped Hoki to scout the bank, but he said that he only went there once and the other 3 cases had nothing to do with him. So next, we need to find the people who helped Hoki to scout the bank the other 3 times and arrest Hoki and Isaac. Well done. Augustus briefly flipped through the interrogation records, patted Ron on the shoulder, and laughed. Finding the other few scouts later is a piece of cake. After saying that, without waiting for Ron to react, Augustus turned his gaze to Lassie and Riyadh and said in a serious tone, "You two, take our FBI plane to California tomorrow, contact the local SWAT, and be sure to catch Isaac and Hoki." "Okay, sir." After briefly distributing some tasks, Augustus waved his hand. "I will do what I promised you. After handling this case, everyone's bonus next week will be doubled. At the same time, I will apply to my superiors for a day off for you." Hearing this, the eyes of everyone in the number 5 investigation team suddenly lit up. "Luo An, Verines is looking for you." Chapter 108 The Truth of the Case and Thank You Money. "Hello, sir." Luo An knocked on the door and entered Verines' office. He saw that the other party was still writing materials with his head down. "Sit down." Verines' tone was the same as always. After motioning Luo An to sit down, Verines flipped the materials in her hand, crossed her legs, and looked up at Luo An. "August just told me that you have caught the scouts of the previous 4 bank robberies?" "That's right." Luo An smiled and nodded. After introducing Chad's identity, he gave Verines a simple reasoning about the case, based on all the clues and information in his hand. A Golden Light film company located in California had financial problems due to poor management and was only one step away from bankruptcy. Isaac, the half-brother of Henry, the boss of Golden Light Film Company, who had been a scourge to other countries for more than 10 years and had just returned to his country at the beginning of this year, decided to help his elder brother. After learning about this, of course, it is not ruled out that Isaac simply wanted to make a quick buck, and helping his elder brother was a temporary idea later. It happened that Fletcher sent his script to Hollywood for registration. Isaac got the script from Henry by some unknown means. After simply reading the script and designing it according to his own experience, Isaac immediately boarded a plane to New York to find his former comrade in arms, Hoki. Hoki's quality of life has always been poor, so he was quickly persuaded by his former comrades in arms. However, thinking of Hoki's gay identity, Luo An felt that Isaac's process of persuading Hoki might not be that simple. But no matter how Isaac persuaded Hoki, the two of them carefully planned for a period of time and officially debuted in New York. One of the tattoos seen by passers-by was also written by Hoki according to the script, and was deliberately drawn on the arm to confuse the police. As for who helped Hoki draw the tattoo, according to the information found by William and other technicians, Isaac had learned and made tattoos for his teammates when he was in the army. This is the general process of the whole case. Luo An looked at the curvy figure in front of him and grinned. Our number 5 investigation team needs to do 2 things next. First, find the people who scouted the other 3 bank robberies, and second, arrest Hoki and Isaac immediately. Augustus has already arranged these 2 tasks. Of course, there is still one question that has not been answered in the whole case. That is, what happened to the robbers of the 5th and 6th robberies, the missing reporter and groom mentioned by Brandon. But considering that these people are related to the gangs in that area, Luo An decided to go back and go fishing with Norton to see if he has any relevant news. Very good. After listening to Luo An's narration, Verines narrowed her eyes slightly, raised the corners of her mouth, and nodded with great satisfaction. Then, before Luo An could speak, Verines' face returned to its original state again. After a light cough, she said calmly, "Since the case has been solved, I will report this to the chief later. You don't have to go this time." Hearing Verines' words, Luo An still had a smile on his face, without any dissatisfaction. He was just an ordinary grassroots detective, and he often came to see the team leader Verines. It was also allowed by the team leader Augustus to know, and they were from the same foundation. Special Agent Director Corbett was the superior of the team leader, and Luo An had never heard Verines or Augustus say that the other party had any relationship with the Columbus Foundation. Verines was a very comfortable thigh to hug, and Luo An had no intention of changing his job. So for FBI chiefs of the level of Corbett, Luo An felt that it was better to see them less. First, to understand Verines' heart, indicating that she had no intention of changing jobs, and second, one was that they had only met once, and the two sides exchanged less than 10 sentences, and they didn't know what the other party's attitude was towards him. He was an old white man with a Mediterranean hairstyle. One is a female supervisor who has met and communicated with her many times, who admires her very much, and has a curvy figure, and is almost mature. Even a fool would know which one to choose. Good. Seeing that Luo An did not show any dissatisfaction after hearing what she said, Verines' face did not change, but she nodded repeatedly in her heart with great satisfaction. Sure enough, she did not make a mistake. So Verines stopped talking nonsense and said directly, I have said before that, if this case is successfully solved within the specified time, you will be promoted to a senior agent. The last time I took you to see the special agent supervisor, the other party had already agreed to this. After this case is thoroughly handled, the relevant documents will be officially issued to your number 5 investigation team. Thank you, sir. Hearing this, Luo An showed a sunny smile on his face. After a few seconds of pausing, he raised his eyebrows. What about you, sir? I remember. Verines had said before that, if this case was solved, she would have the opportunity to move up a level. The next level up from the team supervisor is the special agent supervisor. This is another reason why Roan didn't want to have more contact with Corbett. His own big shot has the opportunity to become the new special agent in charge, so why bother hugging the big shot of the previous special agent in charge? Hearing Roan's question, Verines was slightly stunned. After a moment, Verines narrowed her eyes and looked at Roan with deep meaning. She leaned back, switched her legs, and said calmly, Corbett, as the special agent in charge of the FBI New York branch, has worked for a long time and has excellent work ability. The Washington headquarters has noticed him. If nothing unexpected happens, in 9 months, he will be promoted to the Washington headquarters together with the director and deputy director of our FBI New York branch. 9 months. Roan's eyes lit up, and he immediately extracted the keywords in Verines' words. That's right. Verines showed a satisfied light in her eyes for Roan's reaction speed. At this point, the two of them changed the topic at the same time. After Verines asked about some details of the case, she stood up and prepared to leave the office. That's right. Verines suddenly remembered something. When she was about to stand up, she sat back down and said to Luo An, remember what I said before, after catching the robbers who robbed these 6 banks, these 6 banks will give a thank you money? Of course. Luo An nodded. Why did he work so hard to solve this case? It was for this thank you money. But banks are banks after all. The thank you money they pay won't be very much. Luo An's expression did not change after hearing Verines' words. He was mentally prepared for this. America is a capitalist country, and banks are the capital of capital. It is impossible to expect them to pay $1 million in thank you money like Sabina did before. Even if the president came, he couldn't do it. Sure enough, Verines said, after taking over this case, I contacted these banks. They all said that, as long as the robbers were caught, the bank was willing to pay $100,000 in thank you money. Hearing this, Luo An's eyes lit up. This was much more than he had guessed before. Even though one bank gave less money, many banks were robbed. One bank gave $100,000, and 6 banks gave $600,000. Of course, this money belongs to everyone in the number 5 investigation team. But Luo An will definitely get a lot. Just as Luo An lowered his head to calculate how much money he could get, Verines took out one of the folders beside him and threw it into Luo An's arms. One more thing. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 109, Security Consultant and Case Closure. Opening the folder, there was a contract certificate inside. What is this? Luo An tilted his head to look at Verines, somewhat puzzled. This is the contract of the robbed banks, planning to hire FBI insiders as their bank's security consultant. Hearing Luo An's question, Verine's mouth corners slightly raised, put away her crossed legs, leaned forward, and said, at that time, after these banks learned about Bruce's resume and his experience in solving cases over the years, they thought that it would not be difficult for Bruce to solve the case within the specified time. So after a brief chat with the Special Agent Director Corbett, the bank planned to hire Bruce as the security consultant of these banks after the case was solved. Hearing the word consultant, Luo An's mouth corners widened, and his eyebrows raised. In the United States, in addition to the magical legal political donations, there is also a phenomenon called political revolving door. That is, after some American government officials retire or leave their jobs, they enter large companies, lobbying groups, industry associations, law firms and other organizations to achieve re-employment. At the same time, talents in these large companies, lobbying groups, industry associations, law firms and other organizations will also be absorbed by the US government, switch to work for the US government, and become government officials. And consultants are an important position in the political revolving door. No one can tell what this position does specifically, but what everyone knows is that people who hire consultants will inevitably pay consultants a large salary. Of course, Brunson, a security consultant, certainly cannot reach the level of a political revolving door. But as long as he becomes a security consultant, he will definitely get consulting fees from the bank. Thinking of this, Luo An had some guesses and looked up at Verines. Verines narrowed her eyes and continued in a calm voice, but within the specified time, Bruce did not successfully solve the case, so the job of security consultant was not accepted by Bruce. However, the bank did not take away the contract, but said that whoever can solve the case will be the security consultant. Now that the case has been solved by you, the position of consultant naturally belongs to you. Hearing Verine's words, Luo An's eyes suddenly lit up, licked his lips, and said with a smile, "Thank you very much for your support, sir." Verines curled her lips slightly and gave a few simple instructions, telling Luo An to keep the document, and someone would sign the contract with him when the bank paid the thank you money. Then, Verines waved her hand, indicating that Luo An could leave her office. She was going to report the cracking of the serial bank robbery case to Special Agent Chief Corbett. Back to the 5th investigation team, Augustus was planning to take Reed and Lassie to the conference room for a meeting, arranging for them to go to California tomorrow and work with some local FBI departments. "Sir, I will also participate in this operation." Upon hearing this news, Roan immediately threw the folder to his workstation, and then smiled at Augustus. "I have never arrested anyone across state lines. When the FBI conducts law enforcement across state lines, it often involves specific actions to arrest people, and will ask the local SWAT for help. When searching for relevant evidence, the local trace examination department will also provide assistance." So Roan and his team only went there to supervise the operation, and were responsible for bringing the criminals and related evidence back safely. Of course, there must be more than Roan, Reed and Lassie escorting the robbers back to New York. The FBI has a special plane for this situation, and there are corresponding armed forces in the special plane. Augustus hesitated for a few seconds, and agreed to Roan's request. For the FBI, cross-state law enforcement is a normal thing. This operation is relatively simple, just arresting people, so it is good for Roan to feel the specific situation of cross-state law enforcement, which will help him train his performance when facing such a situation in the future. The four of them discussed for a long time in the conference room. Mainly Augustus was talking, while Roan, Reed and Lassie were listening. After the meeting, Roan first went to Augustus's team leader's office and briefly talked to him about some details that he didn't understand just now, and then returned to his workstation. Roan. Just as he sat down on his chair and hadn't stretched yet, Mona smiled and rubbed her hands and came over. Hearing Mona calling him, Roan immediately tilted his head to look at her. But when he saw the other person's appearance, Roan's mouth twitched, and he subconsciously stepped back a chair. "Mona, what are you doing?" After saying that, Roan suddenly reacted. No. What is there to be afraid of? Nothing. I just have a question to ask you. Mona smiled, quickly moved her chair to Roan's side, and whispered, how much is the thank you money after this bank robbery? Glancing at Mona, Roan didn't hide it from her, and directly told her the number of 600,000. What? Hearing Luo An's words, Mona's eyes widened, and she covered her mouth and exclaimed, 600,000 in one bank? How is that possible? One bank has 100,000, and 6 banks add up to 600,000. Luo An rolled his eyes. Don't you know the situation of those banks? 100,000 is just cutting their flesh. That's not a small amount. Mona smiled and took out a calculator from somewhere and started calculating. Seeing this scene, Luo An's mouth twitched. Is Mona so short of money? Soon, it was time to get off work again, because she had to go on a business trip tomorrow. Lassie was serious for once. She didn't go to the bar to have fun at night, but went home to rest for a night. Riyad went home to find his wife and children as usual. Luo An wanted to eat at Mona's house, but failed. Early the next morning, Luo An and the other two boarded the FBI's special plane and went to California, far away on the other side of the federal continent. 6 hours later, the three successfully arrived in California. After completing the connection with the local FBI department, they went straight to the 3 target persons. Roan took the SWAT and went straight to Hawkeye, who was floating on the sea. Ryder took the SWAT and went straight to the villa where Isaac lived. Lassie's target was Henry Mitchell, the owner of Golden Light Pictures, so she did not bring SWAT, but rushed into the company of Golden Light Pictures with the local FBI's Economic Crime Department. Roan and Ryder's action went smoothly. Hawkeye on the yacht wanted to jump into the sea to escape, but was shot in the thigh by Roan, and his head hit the edge of the yacht directly, and he fell into a coma. Isaac, who was having a group sex in the villa, was frightened by Ryder and others who suddenly rushed in, and he shook his body and confessed. After carefully searching the residence of the two, the FBI found some US dollars that had not been dealt with. Now there is evidence and evidence. After Roan and Ryder handled the relevant evidence, they threw the two directly into the FBI's special plane for escorting prisoners the next day. The situation at Golden Light Pictures was a bit complicated, and the accounts could not be processed in a short time. Roan and Riyad had no choice but to return to New York first. But no matter what, the bank robbery case has come to an end here. Augustus did not break his promise and announced on the spot that everyone would have a day off next Monday and go back to work on Tuesday. Thank you, sir. The detectives from the 5th investigation team praised loudly and applauded Augustus and Roan crazily. Upon learning of this, Matthews from the 14th investigation team clenched his fists and his eyes were red. Special Agent Supervisor Corbett sat in the office, looking at the text version of the case report that Verinas had submitted as requested that day, and raised his eyebrows slightly. After thinking for a long time, he slowly ticked Roan's name. Chapter 110 Reasons for the Establishment of Investigation Team Number 5. Sunday, 8 p.m. Katharine Hepburn Bar. Cheers. At a round table deep in the bar, Augustus, Roan, Mona, Ryder, and Lassie all raised their glasses. I'm glad to receive your invitation. Augustus drank the wine in his glass in one gulp, then let out a long breath, and smiled at everyone. I haven't had such a happy drink in a long time. Lassie picked up the bottle and filled Augustus's glass again, and asked with a smile, is your wife very strict in this regard? The number 5 investigation team was established not very long ago, and everyone only had a rough understanding of the family situation of the members of the investigation team. For example, whether they were married, and their family members. For other details, the members of the number 5 investigation team were not very clear to each other. My wife. No, I never drink until I'm unconscious, so she doesn't care about my drinking. Hearing Lassie's words, Augustus smiled and shook his head and patted his big belly again. But my daughter cares about this matter very much, so. Augustus didn't finish his words, but everyone present nodded in understanding. To be honest, Lassie, the bar you chose is a little beyond my expectation. Feeling the quiet music in the bar and the harmonious gathering of people around him, Ryder took a bite of the food on the table, tilted his head to look at Lassie, and said with a smile, "When Luo An told me that the address of tonight's party was chosen by you, I thought you would take us to a bar with a fashion show. Bars with fashion shows are all my treasures, and I will never tell you their addresses." Hearing this, Lassie put down the bottle and turned her head to roll her eyes at Ryder. "And if I give you the address, do you have the courage to go? Ivan is not easy to mess with." Lassie, who has been shopping and chatting with her, knows this very well. Mona also learned about this from Lassie and immediately turned her head with interest and cast her eyes on Ryder. Why not? Seeing the look in the two women's eyes, Riyadh's eyes widened, his face full of seriousness, and he patted his chest vigorously. "Is there a problem with me going there to investigate the case?" Lassie and Mona rolled their eyes immediately. Luo An laughed and didn't say anything, but turned his gaze back to Augustus. "Sir, how was our number 5 investigation team established? Can you tell me?" This question has been in Luo An's mind for a long time. They obviously have a total of 13 investigation teams, and recently established a 14th investigation team. Why is their newly established investigation team ranked 5th? And all the members are new, not a single member of the original number 5 investigation team. Luo An's question also aroused the interest of the remaining 3 people. Like Luo An, Mona had just come to the number 5 investigation team not long ago, and didn't know the specific situation. After Riyadh and Lassie were transferred to the number 5 investigation team, because of their previous work relationship, they subconsciously thought that there was a secret behind this matter, so they didn't ask. Now that Luo An mentioned this matter, they naturally wanted to know the answer behind it. Nothing is hidden. Seeing that the people at the table all looked at him, Augustus raised his eyebrows, drank another glass of wine, and beckoned everyone to come to him. Seeing this, Luo An and the other 4 hurriedly straightened up and leaned over to listen. Then they heard Augustus whisper, "Actually, I don't know either." The 4. Seeing the wonderful expressions on Luo An and the others' faces, Augustus raised his head and laughed. "Okay, no more jokes." After laughing for a while, when Luo An and the other 4 began to discuss several ways to escape the bill in front of him, Augustus hurriedly waved his hand to indicate that it was just a joke. After coughing twice, the 4 people came to Augustus again, and Augustus whispered with a serious expression, "Actually, it was an emergency plan. When the number 5 investigation team still existed, it had handled a major case against a drug lord from a South American country who was dumping flour in New York. The case lasted for half a year. The members of the first 5 investigation teams not only successfully destroyed the drug trafficking chain of the drug lord, but also caught the drug lord's son who was responsible for the operation of this route. After knowing that his son was caught by the FBI and put in prison to pick up soap every day, the drug lord was furious. While trying to save his son, he kept sending assassins to sneak into the federal territory, wanting to kill all the members of the first 5 investigation teams responsible for this case. Verines didn't know where she got the news from. For the sake of the safety of the people below, she chose to seal all the files related to this case, and at the same time, disbanded all the members of the first 5 investigation teams, and dispersed them to other departments of the FBI New York branch. Hearing this, Luo An raised his eyebrows. Verines is indeed a good leader who values humanity. Then he whispered, "What about the big drug lord in South America?" Verines is indeed humane, but she also has a petty personality. Luo An thinks that Verines is unlikely to keep the other party. He died half a year ago. The cause of death was a sudden myocardial infarction. Augustus picked up the wine glass on the table, took a sip, and said with a smile, "After his death, the power was divided among his former subordinates, and the assassins who entered the federal territory were also cleared. Of course, in order to prevent accidents, Verines did not recall the former number 5 investigation team, but took the opportunity to set up a new number 5 investigation team. That is us." Hearing this, Riyadh, Lassie and Mona looked at each other and laughed together. Luo An narrowed his eyes and found that the thigh behind Verines seemed to be thicker than he imagined. Luo An dared not say 100% of the big drug lords in South America, but 70% were supported by relevant departments in the United States. These people are drug lords on the surface, but in fact they are agents of relevant departments. Verines can actually find a way to kill this kind of person. Although he didn't know what method Verines used, Luo An took a sip of wine, his mouth slightly curled, and his heart increased the importance of Verines to himself. At the same time, he silently made up his mind, I'm determined to hold on to this big thigh, and even Jesus can't stop me. As for whether the drug lord really died of myocardial infarction by chance, thinking of what Lydia, the female owner of the Flame Queen bar, said before, and thinking about the CIA, that does all kinds of evil, Luo An feels that there are probably not so many coincidences in this world. The few of them continued to chat for a while, and Ryder suddenly remembered something, and asked with his head tilted, by the way, Luo An, didn't you agree to go fishing with Agent Norton from the Organized Crime Investigation Division before? Without waiting for Luo An to answer, Mona frowned and turned to ask, fishing? Luo An, do you have a fishing license? In the United States, fishing is not free. Fishing in public places requires a fishing license. She didn't want to see Luo An being pulled away and fined by the NYPD for fishing without a license. I don't have a fishing license, but yesterday was free fishing day in New York. People without a fishing license can also fish on this day, so Luo An went fishing with Norton yesterday. How many fish did you catch? Riyad's eyes lit up, and Augustus also looked at Roan with interest. Norton caught a few bass. Seeing the looks in their eyes, Roan shrugged, but when I got there, I found that I forgot to bring some things, so I didn't go fishing, but just watched Norton fish for the whole morning. Forgot to bring things? Lassie next to him raised her mouth when she heard this. You didn't forget to bring a fishing rod. Mona covered her mouth and laughed secretly. Riyad and Augustus were stunned for a moment, and then grinned. No. Roan shook his head. I brought a fishing rod, but I forgot to bring a helmet. The 4. Chapter 111. Treasure chest and new case appear. After the party on Sunday night, the 5 people went back to their homes. In the past few days, the system gave Luo An some good and some excellent evaluations. On the night when the bank robber was caught, the system gave him an excellent evaluation. When the treasure chest opened 2 bottles of physical potions, it also opened 2 bottles of hemostatic potions that Luo An had always wanted. At this time, Luo An's system warehouse had 8 bottles of physical potions, 4 bottles of night vision potions, 2 bottles of detoxification potions, 2 bottles of hemostatic potions, 2 bottles of strength potions, 1 bottle of weakness potion, 1 bottle of sleep potion, 1 bottle of scuba potion, and 1 bottle of fire resistance potion. The reappearance of the hemostatic potion made Luo An very excited, because the hemostatic potion can save lives at critical moments. But what Luo An didn't expect was that on Sunday night, after the dinner, the system gave him a good evaluation, and then opened a $50 bill and 2 $100 bills. Looking at the $250 in his hand, Luo An fell into deep thought. The first thing that can be confirmed is that the $250 must be. It shouldn't be the system scolding him. But Luo An didn't understand why the treasure chest would open US dollars again. Since the treasure chest opened a $20 and a $50 bill when he first obtained the system, no matter what the system's evaluation of Luo An was these days, the final reward was potion. Is it because I spent money tonight? Soon after this thought came to his mind, Luo An threw it into the trash can. This is definitely not the reason why the treasure chest opened US dollars again, because he had spent money every day before. Then Luo An guessed whether it was because he invited Augustus to drink tonight. But after thinking for a few seconds, Luo An also ruled out this idea. If the treasure chest would open US dollars just by inviting others to drink, the system in his mind only looks simple, but the internal logic is very smooth, and it is impossible for such an outrageous situation to occur. Finally, Luo An set his eyes on the calendar on the side. Today is exactly the 15th day since I came here and got the system. Luo An narrowed his eyes slightly. If the system treasure chest opened US dollars every 15 days, then there would be a reasonable reason for the current situation. Thinking of this, Luo An decisively drew a circle on the calendar and whispered to himself, after 15 days, let's see what the system treasure chest will open. There was no work on Monday, so Luo An spent the whole day in the small apartment in Greenwich Village to supervise the decoration company's work. According to the person in charge, it is expected that the apartment will be completely completed in 30 days. That night, the system gave Luo An a passing evaluation and opened 2 bottles of physical potions, and no US dollars appeared. Luo An nodded. There were still 14 days left to know whether his guess was right or not. Tuesday, Jacob Federal Building. Good morning, Luo An. In the parking lot, Luo An just walked out of the Chevrolet, and Ryder also drove here. Good morning, Riyadh, there's a seat next to me. Luo An waved and said hello, and after motioning Riyadh to park next to his Chevrolet, the two walked into the Federal Building together. Riyadh, I feel like you're not in a good mental state. In the elevator, Luo An saw Riyadh yawning frequently, and frowned slightly. Didn't you get enough rest last night? Hearing Luo An's words, Riyadh yawned again. I slept a little late yesterday. Okay. Seeing that Riyadh had no intention of explaining, Luo An did not continue to ask. As the elevator door opened, the two entered the office area of the number 5 investigation team together. Then Luo An was surprised to see that Lassie, who used to lie on the table to catch up on sleep in the morning, was actually sitting at her workstation today, typing away on the computer. Looking at Riyadh, who was starting to catch up on sleep at his workstation, and then looking at Lassie, who was full of energy, Luo An immediately raised his eyebrows. Have these two people exchanged souls? Good morning, Roan. Seeing Roan entering the office area, Lassie raised her head and greeted him. Then, without waiting for Roan to answer, Lassie showed Roan the laptop in her hand and asked, remember the wanted criminal we found based on Freddy? Of course. Roan nodded. Freddy was the unlucky guy he hit with a skateboard before. Although the other party was not a bank robber, someone had contacted him to make a bomb. Afterwards, Roan entered the information described by Freddy into the computer and found that the person who asked him to make a bomb was a wanted criminal listed in the FBI database. Ogden Scott, a reward of $400,000. When I went out to play games last night, I met a guy who looked very much like Ogden in an underground dance hall. Hearing what Lassie said, Roan was stunned at first, and then asked, is it really Ogden? I wasn't sure yesterday, but now I'm sure it is indeed him. Seeing the expression on Roan's face, Lassie spread her hands and explained, when I went there to dance last night, I found a white man leading a group of people walking out from the depths of the dance hall. The lights were too bright at the time. I just felt that the guy walking in the front looked familiar, but I couldn't remember where I had seen him. It was not until the other party left there that I remembered that I had seen his photo on your computer before. But when I chased out, Ogden's group had already driven away from the dance hall. I was still a step too late. Don't blame yourself, Lassie. This is not your fault. The lights in the dance hall are so bright that it is difficult to see Ogden's face clearly. Roan patted Lassie on the shoulder. This kind of thing is definitely not her fault. Lassie shrugged and said nothing more. She pointed to the information in the computer and continued, but luckily, I asked for the license plate numbers of those people in Ogden last night. Based on the license plate numbers in the surveillance video, I have just found their current location. Seeing the address and photos in the laptop, Roan grinned. Just as he was about to say something, Augustus' familiar loud voice rang out at the door of the number 5 investigation team. Good morning, gentlemen and ladies, agents. Roan looked back and saw Augustus once again walking into the number 5 investigation team with Mona. Mona greeted Roan and sat back at her workstation with her laptop in her arms. Augustus, carrying 2 folders, strode into the front of the number 5 investigation team's office area. Congratulations, everyone. The happy holiday is over. We have a new case today. Handing one of the folders to William and asking him to distribute the information inside to everyone, Augustus opened another folder and read aloud. Evander Davis from Upper Brooklyn was unfortunately involved in a car accident last night and died on the spot. This case was ruled an accident by the NYPD, but my superior, team leader Verinus, asked us to look into the case carefully, including the autopsy report and the NYPD report. After listening to Augustus' description, all the detectives of investigation team number 5 frowned, and Lassie raised her hand and asked, Sir, Car accidents do not seem to be within our scope of work. You're right. Without waiting for Augustus to answer, Verinus's cold voice came from outside the door of investigation team number 5. Hello, sir. He waved his hand, signaling everyone not to continue talking, then walked to the front of the office area, looked at everyone with a serious face and said, but this time the order comes from Washington, and it is the highest priority. Hearing this, the faces of everyone in the number 5 investigation team became solemn. Chapter 112. If nothing unexpected happens, it should be an accident. After Verines finished speaking, all the members of the number 5 investigation team frowned. Augustus was no exception, as Verines had not told him this just now. Luo An looked through the information in his hand, pondered for a few seconds, looked up and asked, Sir, does this Evander Davis have any relationship with our FBI? Verines shook her head. As far as I know, no. Mona on the side remembered something, and asked with an unnatural expression, then this Evander Davis is related to a certain official in Washington? The information doesn't show this. Verines understood what Mona meant, shook her head and said seriously, everyone, this mission is just a routine mission. We just need to investigate the accidental car accident that Evander Davis experienced last night, and make sure it was really just an accident, understand? The agents of the number 5 investigation team nodded in unison. Understood. Verines tilted her head and looked at Augustus. It's up to you next. No problem, sir. Seeing Augustus agreed in a deep voice, Verines nodded with satisfaction. After glancing at Luo An, she turned and left the office area of the number 5 investigation team. Okay, everyone, this case doesn't look complicated. After Verine's figure completely left the number 5 investigation team, Augustus threw the folder in his hand and was about to arrange the next work when Ron and Lassie suddenly raised their hands to indicate that they had something to say. What's wrong? Augustus raised his eyebrows. You two found the clue so quickly? It is indeed a clue, but not for this case. Ron smiled and cast his eyes on Lassie. Lassie didn't waste any words and directly picked up the laptop on the workstation and briefly told Augustus about her latest encounter with Ogden. You have good luck, Lassie. After listening to Lassie's description, Augustus was stunned at first and then grinned. Didn't you take the time to buy some Powerball lottery tickets last night? I decided to buy them later. Lassie shrugged and asked, what should we do with this Ogden next? Of course, catch him immediately. The reward for Ogden is as high as $400,000. Who would think that the money is too much? After a long pause, Augustus patted Riyadh's shoulder, then tilted his head and said to Lassie, you two go together, be safe, and be careful. Okay, sir. The two nodded in agreement. Ron. Seeing Riyadh and Lassie going to the equipment depot together, Augustus turned to Ron and said, I'll leave it to you and Mona to investigate whether the car accident was an accident. No problem. Ron nodded in agreement and then sighed. It's not that Ron also wants to arrest Ogden. He found the clues about Ogden before, and he can also get a share of the money after that guy is caught. The reason Ron sighed was this car accident. When he saw this car accident case, Ron had a hunch. If nothing unexpected happens, this car accident should not be an accident. The home of the deceased Evander Davis. The NYPD told me that Evander was driving last night and crashed into a tree beside the road in order to avoid an animal that suddenly rushed out. In the living room, Evander's wife Tanaya's eyes were red and she sobbed as she said, I had already prepared supper and was waiting for him at home, but I didn't expect. The accident last night took place in a small forest area outside New York. Evander drove into a tree beside the road. The front of the car was lifted up and the driver was injured in the head and died on the spot. Sorry. Mona, who was sitting next to Tanaya, took out a tissue and handed it to her. After Tanaya's permission, Ron walked into Evander's study. After comforting Tanaya for a while, Mona saw that her emotions had stabilized, so she asked in a gentle voice, Tanya, what is Evander's job? Is it related to the government? Evander is a photojournalist. Tanaya took a tissue and wiped the tears from her face and whispered, we have just been married for a year and he seldom mentioned his work to me. The content of Tanaya's narration was basically consistent with the information previously investigated by the number 5 investigation team. After hesitating for a few seconds, Mona continued to ask in a low voice, did Evander have any conflicts with anyone during his lifetime? Or did he ever tell you that anyone intended to hurt him? Evander has a good personality and never loses his temper. I married him because of this. Tanya shook her head repeatedly. Evander has a good relationship with his colleagues. I have met every one of them, and none of them seems to have any grudges against Evander. Mona frowned slightly and continued to ask, do you know what Evander's recent work is about? When Mona learned that Evander was a photojournalist, she had a guess. Evander might have taken pictures of something he shouldn't have taken, and then was silenced. I just said that Evander rarely mentioned his work to me. He was only on a business trip recently, which lasted less than a week. Tana's face suddenly changed as she spoke, and she finally reacted. Wait, why do you FBI ask these questions? Why are you investigating this car accident? Seeing Tana holding Mona's shoulders anxiously, Roan, who came out of the study, explained softly, please calm down, Mrs. Davis, these are just routine inquiries, okay? Okay. Tana was silent for a while after hearing this, and then she let go of her hand and nodded slowly. After asking a few more questions, Roan handed his business card to the other party, indicating that if the other party remembered anything later, he could call him. Then, Roan took Mona away from Evander's house. From Tana's point of view, this is indeed an ordinary car accident. Sitting back in the passenger seat of the SUV, Mona picked up her laptop and started typing, and asked, what about you, Roan? Did you find anything just now? I didn't find any useful information in the study, and Evander has always kept the laptop with him. Roan, who was sitting in the driver's seat, started the car and shook his head, but Tana mentioned just now that Evander had been on a business trip recently. I think we can check the address and specific details of his business trip. I'm checking. Mona pointed to the computer in her hand, indicating that she was working. After taking out his cell phone and checking it, Roan raised his eyebrows and said, I just received 2 messages. Evander's car that was in the accident has begun to be moved to the Jacob Federal Building, but Evander's body is still in the NYPD. So we will go to the NYPD first to check Evander's body, and then take his laptop back to the Jacob Federal Building to check the car. No problem. Mona threw Roan an OK gesture, and 10 fingers flew on the keyboard. Roan immediately stepped on the accelerator and the black SUV rushed towards the NYPD. The cause of death of this gentleman is very simple. In the autopsy room of the NYPD, the old white forensic doctor spread his hands. After learning the purpose of Roan and Mona's visit, the car accident caused serious injuries to his head and chest, which eventually led to his death. Roan rested his chin on his hand and pondered for a few seconds, then tilted his head and asked, what about the blood test? Did you find anything? Hearing this, the old forensic doctor smiled and snapped his fingers. Good question. Chapter 113 Thief. Seeing the old medical examiner's actions, Mona's eyes lit up beside Luo An. Did you really find anything? No, nothing. The old medical examiner took off his mask, picked up the coffee next to him, and took a sip slowly. No alcohol, no drugs, no unknown substances, just a little high cholesterol. Mona's eyelids twitched when she heard this, and then glared at him fiercely. The old medical examiner laughed nonchalantly. Mona was about the same age as his daughter, and the old medical examiner's words just now were just a joke to tease others. This is a good thing, Mona. Luo An was not angry, and at the same time he looked up and smiled at the old medical examiner. This shows that Evander simply died in a car accident, right? It's still the most common kind of car accident. The old medical examiner was very satisfied with Luo An's attitude and nodded with a smile, the kind that is not new at all. Mona also reacted at this time. It is indeed a sad thing for someone to die in a car accident, but for them, the FBI, the other party really just died in an accident, which is actually a good thing. The purpose of their trip was to make sure that the other party had indeed died in an accident. Thank you for your judgment. Luo An smiled and stretched out his hand to shake the old forensic doctor, then asked, by the way, when Evander was sent here, did he have any personal belongings? Among them, the laptop. We need to check it. It's all in the office next door. The old forensic doctor smiled and put down the coffee cup, got up and left the autopsy room, and led the two to the bookcase in the office on the left. A few seconds later, the old forensic doctor frowned, and his voice became a little stiff. You too. It seems that this gentleman's personal belongings have been taken away. What? Hearing this, Mona's face suddenly became solemn, and Luo An looked around the office carefully. Is there a surveillance video here? No, in the office. The old forensic doctor shook his head first, then nodded, and hurriedly left the office, and walked towards the morgue opposite the autopsy room, but there is a camera at the door of the morgue. A few minutes later, the surveillance video facing the corridor at the door of the morgue appeared on Mona's computer. A white man with a crew cut, wearing the same uniform as the old medical examiner, but without a mask, slowly entered the office. 30 seconds later, the white man with a crew cut walked out of the office with a bag of things in his hand. The surveillance video was clear enough that Luo An and Mona saw that the white man with a crew cut took away Evander's laptop. Shit. The old medical examiner beside him was furious after watching the video. Seeing Luo An turn his eyes to him, the old medical examiner immediately waved his hands. This guy's not from our bureau. I have worked here for decades and have never seen him. Luo An heard this, looked at Mona first, and then sighed. I knew this case was not that simple. In the office area of the 5th investigation team, in the team leader's office. So, this case is really not an accident? Seeing Augustus close his eyes and raise his right hand to rub his temple, Roan's face was not good either, and he spread his hands. It is probably not an accident. No thief would go to the NYPD autopsy room to steal things. Okay, I will report this to Verinith. Augustus was silent for a moment, looked up at Roan and asked, what are you going to do next? Do you have any ideas? Mona has extracted the person who appeared in the video, and is now doing facial comparison. Roan picked up the coffee, and took a sip, then said, Evander's car that had an accident will be delivered to the Jacob Federal Building in 30 minutes. I will go and take a closer look at that time. Maybe I will find some clues there. Good. Augustus nodded with satisfaction. After a moment of silence, he suddenly slapped his head and said to Roan with a smile, Lassie called me just now. Ogden has been caught by her, and Reardon is expected to be back in half an hour. When this Ogden is brought to court, the 400,000 reward will be issued to you. Luo An smiled when he heard this. Thank you, sir. I will tell Lassie and the others about this. After a brief chat, Luo An stood up and left the team leader's office. Luo An sat back at his workstation and moved his chair to Mona. Just as he was about to speak, Mona pointed at the computer and said, I have already checked the details of Evander's recent business trip. He was invited by the military to go to a certain seaport to take photos of soldiers for publicity in newspapers. The whole process was recorded. Evander obeyed the arrangements throughout the whole process, and no special behavior was found in him, so this car accident should have nothing to do with this business trip. Luo An's eyebrows twitched when he heard the word military, and he subconsciously thought of the story of 9 sheep for $6 million US. Shaking his head and putting aside the thoughts in his mind, Luo An asked, what about the identity of the person who stole the things? No. Mona stopped typing on the keyboard, stretched her hands back, and shook her head and said, that guy has no criminal record, and several nearby prisons can't find his identity. Not only that, I just checked the surveillance videos outside and inside the NYPD, but I didn't see him. There's no one inside the police station? Luo An frowned when he heard this. No. Mona also said solemnly, the other person's figure only appeared once in the surveillance video at the door of the morgue, and I didn't find any signs that the video had been tampered with or erased. The implication is that the white man with a short haircut in the video somehow avoided most of the police in the police station. Hearing this, Luo An's face changed slightly, and he leaned back in his chair, folded his arms across his chest, and stared at the white man with a crew cut in the video. This case may be deeper than we thought. Jacob Federal Building, Trace Inspection Department. The car that Evander had the accident in was finally delivered here. Luo An and Mona were carefully observing the car at this time. The airbag has exploded completely. Opening the door of the cab, Luo An carefully looked at the specific situation of the cab. You know, Luo An. Mona, who was putting on gloves on her hands, raised her eyebrows when she heard Luo An's words. If you drive too fast, the airbag will be of no use. the driver will still be injured or die. Are you suggesting that I drive slower in the future? Luo An heard this, tilted his head and grinned. I will definitely do it next time. Humph. Mona wrinkled her nose, opened the back door, waved her hand to disperse the oncoming dust, and asked, did you find anything? A little bit. Luo An nodded, pointed to the steering wheel of the car and said, there are splattered blood on the dashboard and windshield. Mona tilted her head in confusion. What do you mean? Under normal circumstances, there will be no splattered blood there, because there are airbags as protection, and blocking in the middle. Luo An tugged at the driver's seat belt and explained, but the presence of blood there means that the airbag did not pop out directly at the moment the car was hit. After Evander hit the steering wheel hard and blood spurted out, the airbag finally popped out. So, Mona heard this, her eyes narrowed slightly. This car was tampered with. Chapter 114, Trauma. That's right, and the other party has tampered with it in more than one place. Hearing Mona's words, Luo An nodded, and then pulled out the seat belt on the driver's seat. Someone has tampered with this place too. Mona looked at the damaged seat belt and tilted her head in confusion. Can you explain in detail? The seat belt of Evander's car is equipped with a pre-tensioning function, which means that when the vehicle collides, the seat belt will be tightened in about 0.1 seconds to protect the driver's safety. Luo An showed the car's pre-tensioning device to Mona and said solemnly, but it is obvious that it did not work when the car hit the tree. After listening to Luo An's narration, Mona was silent for a few seconds and slowly swallowed her saliva. Office Area of Investigation Team Number 5. Dear gentlemen and ladies, agents, we have received bad news. Augustus, with a big belly, stood at the front of the office holding a folder and shouted loudly with a serious look. After the hard investigation of agents Ron and Mona, it can be confirmed that this car accident was not an accident. It was a complicated murder case designed to be an accident. I want to know who would set up such a complicated situation to kill an ordinary photojournalist. Now, everyone, get moving. Dig deep into Evander's life experience and find out everything he has done. At this point, Augustus paused and cast his eyes on Mona. Have you found out the identity of the guy who stole Evander's laptop? Not yet. Mona shook her head. The other party is very skilled and seems to know the layout of the cameras and how to avoid them. Now list this thief as suspect number 1. Augustus frowned when he heard this and then turned his gaze to Ron, who was sitting at his workstation and looking down at the information. Ron, what do you think? There is something strange about the process of Evander's car accident. Hearing Augustus calling him, Ron raised his head, held up the information in his hand and said, I don't quite understand how the murderer ensured that Evander's car had a problem on the road in the woods and hit a big tree. So, I suggest that we investigate the first person who called the police. According to the information, their car had been following Evander's car, and they witnessed the whole process of the car accident. I think they may have seen some clues that were overlooked by the NYPD. Very good. After listening to Ron's words, Augustus's big black face was full of satisfaction. Ron always finds clues and ideas, and he is worthy of being a talent he has set his sights on. Augustus waved his hand and said that Ron had the final say on the specific direction of the next investigation. But in the end, Augustus still said to Ron with a serious face, the enemy this time is not simple. At the critical moment, you must pay attention to safety. The most important thing is to protect yourself. Okay, sir. Ron grinned when he heard this. When he walked into the equipment warehouse, he took a few more stun grenades than before. Lassie, who was on a mission with him, the sub soon arrived at the outskirts of the community where the people who reported the car accident lived. According to the information, the people who reported the car accident are a couple. The husband is an engineer and the wife is a teacher. Lassie flipped through the information in her hand and said nonchalantly, it looks like an ordinary middle-class family. They probably just happened to run into this car accident. I hope so. Hearing Lassie's words, Luo An replied casually, carefully checked his equipment, and after confirming that there was no problem with the plate armor vest plus stun grenade plus 2 Glock 18s plus extended magazines, he pushed open the car door and got out of the car. Dung. 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 Hello. Is anyone home? Lassie walked up and knocked hard on the door of the house. After waiting for a few seconds, footsteps were heard, and a male voice came from the room. "Who are you?" "FBI." Lassie took out the golden badge and showed it to the other party. "We have something to ask." Seeing the golden badge, the door was opened a few seconds later, and a middle-aged white man with red eyes appeared in front of Luo An and Lassie. "Sorry." The male owner of the house, Chance, hurriedly invited the two to enter the living room, first poured a glass of water for Luo An and Lassie, and then pushed the books on the table aside. Finally, he sat on the sofa, rubbed his hands, looked at Luo An and Lassie, and asked loudly, "Excuse me, what can you do with me?" Seeing the other party walking around the house in leather shoes and a work shirt, and accidentally revealing a brand new mark on his wrist, Luo An immediately frowned. "Don't be nervous, Mr. Chance." Lassie raised her eyebrows, and then asked in a gentle voice, "We are here this time to ask for some details about the car accident you reported to the police last night." "Okay, no problem." Hearing Lassie's words, Chance nodded hurriedly, and then forced a smile. "What details do you want to ask?" Lassie was about to speak, and Luo An suddenly stretched out his hand to stop her. In Lassie's puzzled eyes, Luo An asked loudly, "Excuse me, Mr. Chance, what did you and your wife do last night? Why did you come home so late?" On the other side, Luo An took out a piece of paper from the book next to him, picked up a pen and wrote something, and then showed it to Chance. Confused, Lassie glanced at Luo An and also cast her eyes on the paper. The words written on the paper were, "Mr. Chance, please answer my questions normally, and don't change your tone. At the same time, if your wife is being coerced, please put your left and right hands together, and we will do our best to rescue her." After reading what Luo An wrote, Lassie's pupils shrank instantly, and she subconsciously reached for the pistol at her waist. Chance's pupils also trembled, and he looked at Luo An in shock. Seeing Luo An impatiently shaking the paper, Chance, who finally reacted, immediately put his hands together, nodded frantically, and pointed to the bedroom upstairs, and said with trembling lips, "My husband and I went to a concert last night, so we got home a little late." Lassie didn't care about Chance's answer anymore. She was very shocked now, and wanted to ask Luo An how he found out. But saving people was the most important thing at the critical moment, so Lassie took out the pistol and looked at Luo An, silently asking, "What should I do next?" At this time, Luo An's face was very solemn. After thinking for a few seconds, he continued to ask questions to Chance while writing on the paper, "Call for support. Keep asking questions. Don't show any flaws. I'll find a way to go upstairs." Seeing Luo An's words, Lassie took a deep breath and nodded heavily, then turned around and began to comfort Mr. Chance's emotions, writing to make the other party speak more normally, and continued to ask him questions. At the same time, Lassie took out her mobile phone and sent a text message, briefly explaining the current situation and calling for support. On the other side, Luo An, who was fully armed, looked solemn, holding a Glock 18, slowly walked up the stairs in a combat posture, and successfully entered the second floor of the house without making any noise. There are 3 bedrooms on the second floor of the house, and only the master bedroom door is closed. In addition, Mr. Chance just said that his wife was in the master bedroom. Luo An immediately moved to the side of the master bedroom door. Standing at the door of the bedroom, 2 breathing sounds were faintly heard from the room. Luo An saw this, curled the corner of his mouth, and slowly took out a stun grenade from his pocket. But the next second, bang, crash, just as Luo An took a deep breath and prepared to act, there was a loud noise in the master bedroom, followed by the sound of glass breaking. Fuck. Hearing this sound, Luo An cursed inwardly and immediately kicked open the bedroom door and rushed in. Chapter 115 CIA Agent. In the master bedroom, a middle-aged white woman, neatly dressed and gagged, was tied to a chair with her hands behind her back. Bang! The loud noise from the bedroom door being kicked open frightened her and made her tremble all over. She was already in a state of fear, and she almost cried out. However, after seeing the FBI logo on Luo An, the woman paused and then hurriedly cried. But Luo An glanced and found that the other party was not injured, so he ignored her. The window on the left side of the master bedroom was completely broken at this moment. The moment Luo An broke into the room, he clearly saw a black figure jumping out of the window. He ran quickly to the broken window and saw a white man with a crew cut rolling forward on the grass outside the house, and then immediately stood up and ran away. There were obstacles where the other party was running, and Luo An couldn't shoot directly. He didn't hesitate at the moment. In the astonished eyes of the woman, he jumped out of the broken window in the master bedroom like the white man with a crew cut. When the sound of glass breaking came from the second floor of the house, Lassie in the living room on the first floor also stood up suddenly. She grabbed Mr. Chance and asked him to hide behind the sofa. Just as Lassie was about to rush upstairs, she saw someone jumping into the yard. Seeing this, Lassie decisively picked up the pistol and rushed out of the living room. Bang! As soon as Lassie ran out, Luo An's figure fell heavily beside her. Fouquet. Lassie was frightened by Luo An who fell from the sky, but Luo An didn't waste any words and said directly, "You left and I'm right." After that, without waiting for Lassie to react, Luo An's figure rushed out in the direction where the short-haired white man fled like a sword. Shit. Seeing Roan disappear in the blink of an eye, Lassie was shocked. After she realized what was happening, she hurriedly ran in another direction, cursing in a low voice, "Damn it, I must ask Roan what he eats every day. Why can he run so fast, even though he is wearing so much?" On the other side, the white man with a crew cut saw Roan, who was fully armed, but getting closer and closer to him, and didn't look tired at all. He was shocked and cursed, "Son of the beach. What's wrong with this FBI?" In his plan, Roan was wearing so much, it would be very easy to get rid of him, at least 2 sharp turns, and no more than 4 sharp turns. But now there are 7 sharp turns, and Roan is not only not thrown away by him, but getting closer and closer to him. Listen up, people in front. Roan jumped over the trash can that was dragged to the ground by the white man with a crew cut. He measured the distance between the two sides, and made sure there were no obstacles between them. He raised his Glock 18 and shouted loudly, "If you run again, I will shoot." There was no other way. The other party had never shot at him. If Roan shot without explanation, he would definitely face some procedural problems later. From the perspective of American law, being shot in the back and being shot in the chest are 2 different things. And the other party is not black. Cough cough. Hearing Roan's words, that he was going to shoot him, the white man with a crew cut was slightly startled but not panicked. Because the hit rate of shooting while running would not be too high, he did not believe that the FBI with good physical strength could have a very accurate shooting skill. At most, he would just shoot a few random shots, and there was a sharp turn in front of him. As long as he ran one more step, he would have a chance to get rid of this damn FBI. The next second, Roan narrowed his eyes and pulled the trigger decisively. Bang, bang, bang. There were 3 shots in total, one of which hit the right back of the white man with a crew cut, and the remaining 2 hit his left and right calves. Bang. Ah, the white man with a crew cut screamed and fell forward to the ground. Feeling the pain from all parts of his body, the white man with a crew cut cursed in his heart, but no curse sound came out of his mouth. "Run, you keep running." Walking slowly to the side of the white man with a crew cut, Luo An, holding a Glock 18, said coldly, "Why don't you run?" The white man with a crew cut didn't say anything, just stared at Luo An coldly. Luo An had some ideas in his heart, then raised his mouth, put away the pistol, took out the handcuffs, and walked to the side of the white man with a crew cut, ready to handcuff him. At this moment, the white man with a crew cut suddenly jumped up despite the pain, and while his left hand reached for the pistol on Luo An's waist, his right hand suddenly reached for Luo An's neck. The white man with the buzz cut was waiting for this moment. Getting hurt was a common occurrence for him, but he always won in the end. The reason was simple, that is, he could always turn the tables and hit the enemy's face when others thought they had won. But at this moment, a sudden gust of wind hit the white man with the buzz cut. His face was hit hard, his nose collapsed, and his body hit the wall behind him. Luo An knocked the white man with the buzz cut away with a straight punch, stepped forward, and then kicked him hard in the nose. The nose is one of the most vulnerable parts of the human body. A critical hit will make people lose their concentration instantly. Luo An's 2 consecutive critical hits directly stunned the white man with the buzz cut. "Do you think I didn't notice your little move?" Seeing the incredible expression on the other party's face, Luo An grinned. I will never let my guard down against the enemy, even if the other party is shot and falls to the ground. Hearing Luo An's words, the white man with the buzz cut instantly spurted out a mouthful of blood from his mouth, and his face instantly turned liver colored. Damn, what kind of people are in the FBI now? After taking a few deep breaths, the white man with the crew cut slowly calmed down, wiped the blood off his face, then looked up at Luo An and said coldly, I am. Bang. As soon as the white man with the crew cut started to speak, Luo An kicked him in the neck and knocked him unconscious. I don't care who you are. The other party's attempt to strangle her neck and snatch the gun just now was not fake. When Lassie finally arrived here with a pistol, she saw a white man with a crew cut lying on the ground covered in blood, and Luo An was holding a mobile phone to make a call. Just in time. Seeing Lassie, Luo An hung up the phone and waved to her with a smile. The ambulance will be here soon. You take this guy to the hospital. Make sure to take good care of him. Augustus will call me back if there is something. Lassie, who had been running for a long time, heard this, stood there and opened her mouth, and finally sighed, holding her forehead and agreed. Okay. Office area of the 5th investigation team. When Luo An returned here, he found that Mona was not at her workstation. He asked William, but the other party didn't know where she went. Luo An. At this moment, the door of the conference room suddenly opened, and Augustus waved his hand to signal him to come in quickly. Hello, sir. After suppressing the question of where Mona went in his heart, Luo An found Verines here after entering the conference room and hurriedly greeted her. Yeah. Verines nodded expressionlessly, motioned Luo An and Augustus to sit down, and pointed to the white old lady with grey hair sitting on the other side of the conference table in a suit, and introduced in a cold voice, this is Mrs. Heloise from the CIA. The white man with the crew cut who still Levander's laptop is her agent. Hearing Verines' words, Luo An was stunned at first, and then his expression began to become strange. After briefly introducing the situation of both parties, Verines straightened up and looked coldly at the old lady sitting opposite her. Mrs. Heloise, what is the situation of this case? Why did your CIA intervene? According to regulations, the CIA is not allowed to operate within the federal territory. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 116 Jacqueline John. Investigation Team Number 5, in the meeting room. Upon hearing Verines' words, the grey-haired Mrs. Heloise had no expression on her face. After taking a sip of the coffee on the table, she said very calmly, this matter is very risky. In this situation, we usually act first and then ask for forgiveness and approval. Verines and Augustus looked unhappy when they heard this. Luo An, who was standing aside, had no expression on his face, but nodded in his heart. That's right, it's the style of the CIA. In his previous life, he had seen a statement on the internet that the FBI, and local police officers use their lives to eliminate drug dealers, but behind those drug dealers were the CIA. The CIA has never disappointed people in terms of not doing human work. HMPH. Seeing the indifferent expression on Mrs. Heloise's face, Verines snorted coldly and asked in a deep voice, what is the matter with this car accident? Mrs. Heloise did not speak, slowly cast her eyes to Luo An beside her, and said in a low voice, it seems that the rank of this agent is not enough. Luo An ignored her. Verines narrowed her eyes slightly and leaned back. Agent Luo An Greenwood is a senior agent of the number 5 investigation team. The appointment letter is now in my office. Hearing this, Mrs. Heloise raised her eyebrows and stared at Verines. Verines did not show any weakness and stared back expressionlessly. The two women of different ages stared at each other for a moment, and finally Mrs. Heloise's face changed slightly. After a long silence, she spoke, this matter is related to a soldier named Jacqueline John. Hearing the name Jacqueline John, Luo An was stunned at first, and then his eyebrows jumped violently. This name sounded familiar. Ron lowered his head to think. Madam Hello Eyes stroked the hair beside her ears and continued. Jackwell John was one of the soldiers who survived after a mission failed and was judged dead. But afterwards, he became an avenger and wanted to kill all the officers who arranged the mission to avenge his dead comrades. Verinis also vaguely felt that the name Jackwell sounded familiar, but she couldn't remember where she had heard it for a moment. However, after hearing what Madam Hello Eyes said, Verinis sneered in her heart. Everyone knows the little things that the CIA has done. However, there are still some issues that have not been clarified in this case. So Verines asked directly, what does this have to do with Evander? Evander was invited to participate in that operation as a reporter. Mrs. Hello Eyes leaned back, crossed her hands on her thighs, and said in a low voice, but before the mission officially started, Evander temporarily withdrew, so he survived. Jackwell may have thought that Evander knew some inside information and that Evander was in cahoots with their superiors, so he killed him. In fact, Evander had nothing to do with that mission. Augustus, who was standing aside, listened to this, pondered for a few seconds, then looked up and asked, why did your agent steal Evander's laptop? Is there any information about Jackwell John in the computer? Mrs. Hello Eyes heard this, and after a long silence, she said expressionlessly, there is no information about Jackwell John in the computer. I sent my men to get that computer just to make sure that Evander's computer did not have any information about the original mission. After listening to what Madam Hello Eyes said, Verines asked directly, what exactly was the operation about? Madam Hello Eyes spread her hands and said expressionlessly, sorry, I have nothing to say. As soon as the voice fell, the air in the entire conference room froze instantly. Verines looked at the old lady sitting opposite her with a bad face. The old lady seemed not to see Verines's gaze and still sat in the chair expressionlessly. Sir. Just when the air in the room seemed to be about to explode, Roan coughed lightly, first gave Verines a smile, and then whispered, remember Lydia, the owner of the Flame Queen bar? In the case of the large-scale NSA honey trap, the bar owner Lydia once mentioned one thing, that is, she contacted Roan in order to further contact Mona. And contacting Mona was to contact Mona's father, Jorley Evans, a regional CIA staff operations officer. According to Lydia, a certain operation led by Jorley a year ago was not successful, and there were more casualties than planned. This Jackwell John was one of the soldiers who was judged to be killed in that mission. At the same time, the NSA heard about Jackwell from a domestic gangster and asked the CIA about this matter. After hearing what Roan said, Verines was silent for a while and remembered this matter. Then she looked at Mrs. Hello Eyes with even more unkindness. Mrs. Hello Eyes didn't know about this, but she had some ideas in her heart and planned to go back and check it out. As for Verines's gaze, she pretended not to see it. After taking a sip of coffee, Mrs. Hello Eyes straightened up, looked around, and said in a serious tone, according to the intelligence in my hands, Jackwell John will not leave New York in the short term. So your next task is... Sorry, Mrs. Hello Eyes. The old lady was interrupted by Verines waving her hand, just as she started to speak. Verines left her chair and stood up slowly. She looked at the old lady sitting opposite with a cold face and said in a deep voice, the specific investigation tasks will be directed by me. You only need to observe and make suggestions. Do you understand? Hearing this, the old lady's face changed slightly. After looking at Verines quietly for a long time, she asked, I have more information in my hands, which will allow us to find Jackwell John more quickly. Then give me that information. Verines stared at the other party with her eyes, and her voice was frighteningly cold. The specific investigation tasks will be the responsibility of our FBI. The air in the conference room was quiet for a long time, and finally Mrs. Hello Eyes nodded without changing her expression. Okay, the investigation tasks can be handed over to you. I will also ask my men to send the laptop to you later. No need, Mrs. Hello Eyes. Just tell me where the laptop is, and I'll get it myself. Hearing this, Luo An, who was standing beside Augustus, smiled and said, your men were accidentally injured and have just been sent to the hospital for treatment by my colleagues. Mrs. Hello Eyes. Leaving the conference room, Augustus looked at the old lady's back as she slowly left the number 5 investigation team and tilted his head to look at Vereen's on the side. Sir, this CIA has a lot of things that she didn't explain clearly and she didn't tell us. Next, don't worry about her. I'll find a way to find out the relevant circumstances of that mission. Hearing Augustus' words, Vereen's replied coldly and then cast her eyes on Luo An. The next specific investigation task will be handed over to you, but you must be careful this time. If you find something wrong, save your own safety first and call for support immediately. Understand? Okay, sir. Seeing Luo An smile and nod in agreement, Vereen's nodded with satisfaction and then turned to leave the number 5 investigation team. She planned to go and have a chat with Mr. Clement. She is the team leader of the FBI, and the number 5 investigation team is also responsible for criminal cases, not cleaning up the CIA's ass. Chapter 117 Car Accident Details and Good and Bad News. Hearing Vereen's question, Mr. Clement, who was far away in Washington, leaned back and frowned. I don't know about this, Vereen's, but the order for the case came from Washington. In the office of the team leader, Vereen's, holding the phone, looked unconvinced, and it just happened to be handed over to my number 5 investigation team. Clement felt a headache. After rubbing his temple and thinking for a long time, he said in a deep voice, I will find a way to help you get the details of the original operation. At the same time, after this case is over, I will find a way to let the CIA provide you with some compensation. After all, this case was made by the CIA. With such a good opportunity, Clement himself would not let himself go if he didn't get something from the CIA. Thank you, sir. Hearing the answer she wanted, Vereen's mouth curled slightly, and after a few simple words, she hung up the phone. At the same time, in the office area of the number 5 investigation team, seeing Mona finally appear and return to her workstation, Roan, who was about to leave, turned around and asked with a smile, Mona, what were you doing just now? Some personal matters. Mona smiled and said nothing more, and changed the subject. What stage has the car accident case reached? Seeing that the other party did not want to say more, Roan did not ask in detail. Hearing Mona's question, Roan spread his hands. The case is still at the first step, but we have some additional gains, such as now we know who killed Evander. After briefly describing the situation inside the conference room to Mona, Roan said, Mrs. Heloise will send some information to our number 5 investigation team later. You and William should hurry up to check these materials. I hope to find useful information and then find the trace of Jackal. After listening to Roan's words, Mona nodded grimly, then looked up and asked, what about you? Seeing Riyadh pack up his things and get up to walk towards the equipment room, Roan explained while packing his things, I still wonder how Jackal ensured that Evander's car broke down and hit the tree in the woods. I was busy arresting people when I went to the caller's house before, and I didn't have time to ask about this matter, so I plan to go to the caller's house with Ryder again to see if we can find any useful clues. Okay. Mona suddenly realized and gave Roan an okay gesture. Roan smiled lightly and strode into the equipment room. Mona. At this moment, the door of the team leader's office opened and Augustus came out with a bulging belly and waved, come to my office. Okay, sir. Mona's face changed slightly when she heard this, but after taking a deep breath, she quickly entered the team leader's office. Sit down. In the team leader's office, Augustus said nothing. After motioning Mona to sit down, he immediately asked with a serious face, Mona, Luo An should have told you about the content of the meeting just now, so I won't repeat it. Because your father may be involved in this case, I have only one request for you in the next period of time. Don't go out on field work, okay? Hearing Augustus' words, Mona let out a long breath and immediately nodded and agreed. No problem, sir. Good. Augustus nodded with satisfaction. According to FBI regulations, only when the subject of the case involves the agent's relatives, the agent must take leave to avoid the case. In cases like this where the case background only involves the agent's relatives, FBI agents generally do not take leave and will only work normally. The home of the chance couple who reported the car accident. Please come in, Agent Luo An. Seeing Luo An again, the chance couple was extremely excited. The wife hurriedly invited Roan and Riyad to come in and sit down, while the husband grabbed Roan's hand and refused to let go. "Thank you so much, Agent Roan. Thank you for saving my life. If it weren't for you." Riyad, who was standing by, was very surprised. He was not surprised that Roan saved people, but surprised at the attitude of the chance couple. In America, it is rare to see couples like them express gratitude. "You're welcome, Mr. Chance." Roan's mouth twitched, and he pulled his hand out of Mr. Chance's hand. "The main reason I came here this time is that I have some questions to ask." "No problem." Mr. Chance nodded repeatedly. His wife handed 2 cups of coffee to Roan and Riyad, and then smiled. "Is it about the car accident?" "Yes." Roan nodded and took out a notebook. "When the car accident happened last night, you called the police and said that you had been following behind the car. So you saw the whole process of the car accident clearly. Can you describe it to me in detail?" There was no dash cam at that time, otherwise Roan would not have to go through so much trouble. "Okay, no problem." Hearing Roan's question, Mr. Chance nodded and recalled, "It was about 10:30 at night. My wife and I had just finished a concert and were driving home. The car that had the accident was driving in front of us, not very fast. I wanted to overtake, but that area was a small forest area, and there were a lot of bends. For safety reasons, I didn't choose to overtake in the end. Just as our 2 cars entered the middle section of the forest area, the car in front of us suddenly shook for some reason, then turned sharply to the left and hit the big tree on the side of the road heavily." After listening to Mr. Chance's description, Riyad on the side drank a sip of coffee silently and then cast his eyes on Roan. He didn't hear any problems. "Okay." After briefly recording Mr. Chance's words in the small notebook, Luo An was silent for a moment, then raised his head and asked, "Did you call the police as soon as the accident happened?" "Yes." Mr. and Mrs. Chance nodded in unison and explained, "After we saw that the car had an accident, we immediately called 911. The ambulance came very quickly and took the people away in a short while." Luo An frowned when he heard this and continued to ask, "How many cars were parked there after the accident? Was it only your car?" "No, there should be 2 or 3. Mr. Chance frowned when he heard Luo An's words, and after thinking for a few seconds, he said, "There were cars passing by on that road all the time, and some cars stopped to check the situation. After the ambulance came, my husband and I left, and there may be more cars behind. By the way, Agent Luo An, I remembered something." After listening to Mr. Chance's words, Luo An was about to continue asking questions, but Mrs. Chance suddenly clapped her hands, looked at Luo An with joy on her face and said, "A family happened to pass by at that time, and I noticed that the child was holding a handheld camera. The family did not leave until the ambulance left. If you want to check the specific situation that night, the child's camera may be able to provide you with some help." Hearing Mrs. Chance's words, Luo An's writing hand paused, and his eyebrows raised instantly. Office Area of Investigation Team Number 5. Importing the video of the handheld camera into the computer, Mona's 10 fingers began to fly on the keyboard. A minute later, Mona froze, tilted her head, and looked at Luo An beside her, with a strange tone. "One good news, and one bad news. Luo An, which one do you want to hear first?" Chapter 118 Plastic Cloth Humanoid Silkworm Pupa. Hearing Mona's words, Luo An's face trembled, but he still said in a deep voice, "Let's talk about the bad news first." Mona pointed to the video in the computer. "The bad news is that the accident happened at night. The light was very dim, and most of the video content recorded by the handheld camera was black, and nothing could be seen clearly." Riyad, who was standing by, saw that Mona's computer screen was pitch black, and his face was very interesting. Luo An's face was not good either, but he continued to ask, "What about the good news?" Mona's 10 fingers flew on the keyboard and soon called up the second half of the video. "The good news is that when the ambulance came, there were red and blue lights flashing. Only this short video can show the specific situation at the scene at that time." Seeing the video content in the computer that was shaking because of the handheld camera, Riyad rolled his eyes. "Mona, this is not good news." Mona spread her hands and smiled. But at least there is still a video to watch, which means that your efforts have not been in vain. Luo An didn't say much and silently observed the video in the computer. Riyad was speechless. Just as he was about to speak, a familiar female voice suddenly came from the gate of the number 5 investigation team. "I'm back." Several people turned their heads and found that the person who spoke was Lassie, who was holding a large cardboard box. Riyad hurriedly stood up and took the cardboard box from the other party, then took out a folder from it and asked in confusion, "What are these?" "The information given to me by the CIA." Lassie sat back at her workstation, drank a sip of coffee, and waved her hand. "There is Evander's stolen laptop and the information of a soldier named Jackal." Speaking of the laptop, Lassie looked at Roan with a smile in her eyes. In the hospital, after learning the specific situation of the white man with a short haircut being injured, the old lady's face showed an unusually rich expression. Later, when the old lady ordered her subordinates to hand over the computer and information to her, she looked annoyed, but had to do so. Lassie, who learned the background of the case from Augustus, had a blank expression on her face, but she was already very happy in her heart. The FBI and the CIA have always been at odds, and the FBI is often in a weak position. After all, the FBI is under the jurisdiction of the Department of Justice, and sometimes it is necessary to be reasonable and legal. But the CIA is a separate department, and no one is in charge of them. Lawlessness and unreasonableness are their normal state. Lassie, who came out of the FBI intelligence department, knows this very well. When she worked before, she was often ridiculed by the CIA. So when she learned that the white man with a short haircut who was beaten into the hospital by Luo An was actually from the CIA, Lassie's eyes lit up with joy, and she wanted to stuff all the small cards in her pocket into Luo An. But then Lassie thought about it and felt that it was not good to give all the cards to Luo An. After all, they were teammates, and she still had to consider Luo An's health. So after answering Riyad's question, Lassie slowly approached Luo An, who was watching the video, and quietly stuffed 3 cards into Luo An without attracting the attention of others. Seeing the cards in his pocket, Luo An's face was full of black question marks. He tilted his head to look at Lassie and saw that Lassie's mouth corners were raised. She patted Luo An's shoulder and whispered, "They are all good places, but remember not to play too late. You have to go to work the next day." Although he didn't know what happened, Luo An hesitated for a few seconds and quietly put the card away. He didn't mean anything else, just wanted to gain more knowledge while he was still young. Riyad, who was standing by, simply flipped through the information in the cardboard box for a while and felt a little headache. Looking up, he saw Luo An and Lassie sitting together and whispering. Riyad immediately came over and asked with a smile, "How is it? Have you found anything new?" Hearing Riyad's words, Mona, who was also flipping through the information, turned around and came over. Lassie, who was introducing the scenery, twitched her mouth when she saw this, but Luo An coughed lightly while adjusting the video in the computer. He said with a serious expression, "Pay attention." Hearing this, the 3 of them hurriedly turned their eyes to the computer. The shaking video showed the arrival of the ambulance, 2 female nurses and a driver quickly getting off the car, rescuing the unconscious Evander from the car, and putting him on a stretcher, and finally carrying the stretcher into the ambulance. After the video was played, Mona pondered for a few seconds and her eyes lit up. She decisively turned around and started typing on the keyboard. Lassie watched it again carefully and suddenly realized it. Ryder scratched his head and looked at Roan with a puzzled look. Roan saw this and turned the video to the scene of the ambulance driver getting off the car and patiently explained, "Pay attention to the driver of this ambulance." In the video, the driver of the ambulance was the first to arrive at the scene of the car accident. But the first thing he did was not to ask about the condition of Evander, who was stuck in the driver's seat, nor to prepare to save people, but to reach out to Evander's neck to check whether Evander was dead. This is normal behavior. Ryder tilted his head in confusion after watching the video. "No, pay attention to the details." Roan shook his head and slowed down the video. Only then did Riyad realize that, after finding out that Evander was dead, the ambulance driver nodded slightly, and his stomach also slowly grew bigger. It was obvious that the ambulance driver breathed a sigh of relief. Not only that, the ambulance driver's operation of transferring Evander from the cab was also very direct and rough, the kind that the family members would want to curse after seeing it. After listening to Roan's explanation, Riyad nodded suddenly, and Mona beside him also shouted loudly at this time, "Roan, I found out about the situation of this ambulance driver." Roan and Riyad heard this, and hurriedly leaned over. Mona didn't waste any words and said directly, "The ambulance driver's name is Kinori Martin. After the car accident last night, he took a leave and went home. He didn't go to work today. His colleagues called him but no one answered." Okay. Hearing this, Roan didn't hesitate, and immediately stood up, and led Riyad to the equipment room. "Let's go and talk to Mr. Martin now." A small community in Brooklyn. The dark SUV came from a distance at high speed, and stopped at the side of the street with an emergency brake. Roan, who was driving, and Ryder, who was sitting in the passenger seat, carefully checked their equipment. After confirming that there was no problem, they looked at each other, grinned, and then pushed open the car door, and walked quickly to the community across the street. Martin's home was on the 5th floor. Roan and Ryder arrived here, standing on the left and right sides of the door with guns in both hands. After looking at each other, and counting down to 3, 2, 1, Roan raised his right foot, and kicked the door of this room out with one kick. Bang, FBI. Seeing the door flying into the room, and smashing on the sofa in the living room, Ryder's face was full of shock. But now was not the time to ask questions. Ryder swallowed his saliva and hurriedly followed Roan to check every room in the house. Safe. Safe. After confirming that there was no one in the bedroom, kitchen and bathroom, Roan and Ryder reported together. Putting away the gun, and returning to the living room, Roan began to carefully check the house. Riyad grabbed the door on the sofa, shook it vigorously, and looked at Luo An in disbelief. "Luo An, how did you do that?" "Don't worry about that. Come here." Without answering Riyad's question, Luo An waved his hand to signal him to come to the second bedroom. After dropping the door and entering the room, Riyad saw a human-shaped silkworm pupa wrapped in plastic cloth in the closet of the second bedroom. Not only that, Luo An also found a lot of wires, ball bearings, nails and other items under the bed in the second bedroom. Chapter 119 Timed Thermal Bomb. More than 40 minutes later, Agent Neil from the Trace Examination Department came out of the second bedroom. "Thank you for your hard work." Seeing this, Luo An, who was rummaging in the kitchen, hurried forward and stretched out his hand to shake Agent Neil's chubby hand, then asked with a serious expression, "Who is this body?" Agent Neil smiled on his round face. "The body is well preserved. Judging from the face alone, it should be the Kinori Martin you mentioned." Hearing this, Luo An nodded solemnly, and then continued to ask, "What is the exact time of death of the body?" "The exact time of death can only be accurately known after the autopsy is completed." Agent Neil heard this, laughed, and then said, "But according to my colleague's experience, the time of death of this body should be about 3 days. As for the cause of death, there are strangulation marks on the neck of the body, and it can be roughly judged as mechanical asphyxiation." At this point, Agent Neil took out a transparent evidence bag from behind his buttocks, which contained a ball bearing that Luo An had found in the bedroom before. Seeing the roller bearings, Luo An raised his eyebrows. "If I'm not mistaken, these things should be used to make bombs." "That's right." Agent Neil nodded, and then said seriously, "My colleague just detected some traces of special oily substances in the second bedroom. In addition to these wires, ball bearings and nails, my colleague judged that the other party should want to make a timed thermal bomb." Hearing the name of the timed thermal bomb, Luo An raised his eyebrows. It was one of the improvised explosive devices made by the people of the Shell in the previous life to resist the United States. "Okay, thank you." Hearing Luo An's words, Agent Neil smiled and waved his hand, agreed to go out for a drink together in the future, and left the house with his colleagues and the body. Ding-ling-ling. Just then, Luo An's cell phone rang. "Hello. It's me, Lassie." The voice on the other end of the phone was a little noisy. After the sound of the door closing, the noise became much quieter, and Lassie's voice came over. "Half an hour ago, you asked me to come to the hospital where Martin works to investigate Martin's specific situation. I have almost finished the investigation. Thank you for your hard work." Luo An nodded, sat down on the sofa in this room, and asked in a deep voice, "What is the specific situation?" According to several nurses who often go out with Martin to recruit people, Martin has not come to work these few days. Lassie on the other end of the phone sounded very unhappy. The person who actually drove the ambulance is Martin's distant cousin, a middle-aged white male named Thomas. Luo An frowned when he heard this. What's the situation with this Thomas? Those nurses said that this kind of thing is very common. If someone has something wrong at home, they will find a relative to take over for a few days. The hospital doesn't care. Lassie said with a grim face. I looked through the surveillance videos in the hospital these days, and that Thomas has never taken off his mask in the surveillance. Later I asked the nurses again. They hadn't seen Thomas take off his mask in the past few days, so they didn't know what Thomas looked like. The only thing they knew for sure was that Thomas was quite old, had a high-pitched voice, and had long hair with a lot of white hair. Okay. I wrote Lassie's description on a piece of white paper, and after a brief chat, I hung up the phone. Seeing this, Riyad, who had been waiting for a long time, pushed the door on the sofa aside, and asked with a serious face, Roan, do you think this Thomas is the same person as Jackal? No, they are definitely not the same person. This Thomas should be the helper that Jackal found. Moreover, this Thomas is most likely the one who tampered with Evander's car and eventually caused the car accident. Hearing Riyad's question, Roan shook his head and explained, the information about Jackal brought by the CIA shows that Jackal is 36 years old this year, with a strong body, a short hair, and no white hair. Having said that, Roan took Riyad into the kitchen, opened the door of the cabinet, where the tableau was stored and explained, I just checked carefully. There are 2 sets of tableau that have been used recently. Martin died 3 days ago. He couldn't have used it. The people who use 2 sets of tableau can only be Jackal and Thomas. Okay. Riyad just saw Roan checking the tableau and then handing it over to the trace examination department to let them try to find fingerprints, so he continued to ask, what do we do next? I have asked William and his team to check the surveillance cameras near this building. It is expected that the check will be completed in 30 minutes. By then, there may be the presence of Thomas and Jackal. Luo An handed the paper in his hand to Ryder, then rested his chin on his hand, and pondered for a while. Suddenly, he remembered something, tilted his head, and looked at Ryder and asked, by the way, did you find any credit cards in this room just now? No. Ryder shook his head. The trace examination department and I didn't find any either. Seeing Ryder shaking his head, Luo An's eyes lit up, and he took out his mobile phone and called Mona. What's wrong? Hearing Mona's question, Luo An didn't waste any words and said directly, Mona, check Martin's credit card records to see if there has been any consumption behavior recently. I suspect it is still in the hands of Jackal and Thomas. If Jackal really used Martin's credit card in the past 2 days, then Luo An and his team can find him as quickly as possible. Okay. Mona did not hesitate and immediately started typing on the keyboard. A few minutes later, Mona spread her hands and said to the phone, I'm sorry, Roan, there is no consumption record on Martin's credit card in the past 2 days. On the other end of the phone, Riyad frowned when he heard Mona's words. Roan held his forehead and thought for a moment, then continued to ask, what about before that? Did Martin buy anything wrong? What kind of wrong are you talking about? Mona looked at the consumption records in the computer and said with some confusion, this week's consumption records show that Martin used credit cards to buy clothes, pants, meals, and so on. Mona was stunned when she spoke and then shouted, Roan, Martin's credit card consumption records show that he bought a very expensive school bag 3 days ago. But we didn't find the school bag here. And Martin is alone, without a girlfriend or relatives. What's the use of buying a school bag? Hearing Mona's words, Riyad's eyes suddenly lit up, and he quickly turned to look at Roan. Agent Neil from the trace examination department just said that the roller bearings in the second bedroom can be used to make a timed thermal bomb. Then this backpack must have been bought by Jacqueline and the others, with the purpose of making a backpack bomb. Roan touched his chin and nodded slowly. It is most likely so. Hearing Roan's affirmation, Riyad grinned, put his hands on his hips, and showed a smug smile. But, before Riyad could be proud for too long, Roan looked up in confusion, and asked a question. Jacqueline and Thomas' actions were obviously for revenge. Then they must have a target they want to kill when making the bomb. Who could that target be? Read. Chapter 120. What is the CIA hiding? Hearing Roan's question, the smug smile on Ryder's face froze instantly. Roan saw this and laughed. This question was a bit difficult for Ryder, and Roan didn't expect Ryder to provide him with an answer. Mona. Picking up the phone that had not been hung up, Roan said directly to Mona on the other end of the phone, check the backpack that Martin bought with his credit card right now, and see who else bought the same style of backpack. I suspect that one of the people who bought this style of backpack is Jackwell's next target. If you want to make a backpack bomb, there are plenty of cheap backpacks in various stores in New York. The reason why such an expensive backpack was bought is probably because the target person that Jackwell and his friends want to blow up has children at home, and Jackwell and his friends plan to use their bomb backpack to exchange for the child's ordinary backpack. Okay. Hearing Luo An's words, Mona nodded and agreed without hesitation, but then she said with some entanglement, Luo An, what's wrong? Luo An narrowed his eyes. Are you feeling unwell today? No, I'm fine. Opening her mouth, Mona hesitated for a few seconds, but still didn't say it, and finally said, give me 10 minutes. There are many people who buy this style of backpack. I will call you after I find out. After saying that, without waiting for Luo An to reply, Mona pressed the hang up button on the other end. Hearing the busy tone coming from the phone, Luo An licked his lips and whispered to himself, Mona is not right today. Considering that there is some connection between this case and Mona's father, Luo An immediately judged that Mona had concealed something from him and the other people in the number 5 investigation team. However, after so many days of getting along, Luo An, who already knew Mona's personality and past experiences, guessed that what she concealed was probably just some information related to her father. Anyway, it would not be the kind of information that threatens the lives of the agents in the number 5 investigation team. Mona always knows what is important and what is not. Thinking of this, Luo An chose to put this matter aside for the time being. Mona didn't want to talk about it now, and he wouldn't force her to ask. After hanging up the phone, Luo An looked at Riyad, who was sitting next to him, and said in a deep voice, our next goal is to quickly find and capture Jackwell and Thomas, and find the backpack bomb at the same time. Yeah. Riyad nodded. William and others are checking the surveillance videos near this building and checking the information sent by the CIA, and Mona will go to check the clues of the backpack. The body found here has also been handed over to the trace examination department. What should we do next? Go back to the headquarters? No, I have to make a call. Luo An was silent for a moment after hearing this, and picked up the phone again. While looking for the number, he said, I suddenly remembered something. Investigation team number 5. In the office area, Augustus was leading several technicians to look through the information sent by the CIA with a serious expression. In the conference room, Verines and Mrs. Hello Eyes sat on chairs, watching the busy people outside, without saying a word. The air in the room was very depressing. After a long time, Mrs. Hello Eyes took the coffee on the table and took a sip. Team leader, didn't you tell me before that you would be in charge of this case? What you call command is to sit in the conference room with me and drink coffee? Mrs. Hello Eyes didn't like Verines very much. There were many reasons, such as her subordinates lying in the hospital. The leadership of the investigation mission was not in her hands. Verines' attitude towards her was average, and so on. Verines also hated the old lady around her. Because Mrs. Hello Eyes, as the head of the CIA, was habitually full of lies, and 9 out of 10 sentences were false. And she was arrogant, and had no cooperative attitude, and always wanted the number 5 investigation team to follow her orders to handle the case. So when she heard what Mrs. Hello Eyes said, Verines didn't bother to look at her, and said coldly, Mrs. Hello Eyes, I'm in charge of this case, and I have the final say on how to investigate. Your responsibility is just to observe and make suggestions. Mrs. Hello Eyes' face suddenly turned black, and just as she was about to speak, Verines' mobile phone suddenly rang. It was Roan who called Verines. Good afternoon, sir. Roan briefly described what happened after he left the number 5 investigation team and the current investigation situation. Finally, Roan asked in a deep voice, "Sir, I remember that Mrs. Hello Eyes from the CIA said that the information she had showed that Jackwell John would not leave New York in the short term. I want to know why she came to this conclusion. Or, does the CIA know where Jackwell John will go next?" After hearing what Reed said just now, Roan suddenly remembered what Mrs. Hello Eyes said at the meeting. The CIA guarantee that Jackwell John will not leave New York in the short term. If this information is true, there is only one possibility. The CIA people have always known Jackwell John's goals and movements. But they never told the number 5 investigation team, but watched them investigate bit by bit. Hearing Roan's words, Vereen frowned and reacted quickly. She even thought deeper than Roan. Before Evander's car accident, did the CIA know that Jackwell and his team were planning this? Thinking of this, Vereen immediately turned to look at Mrs. Hello Eyes, and instead of recounting what Roan had just said to her, she asked directly, "Who is Jackwell John's next target? Where is he now?" Mrs. Hello Eyes sipped her coffee expressionlessly and said in a calm voice, "Sorry, I can't comment." Hearing this, Vereen's face instantly darkened. This sentence indirectly showed that the CIA did know about Jackwell's movements. After taking a deep breath, Vereen suppressed the anger in her heart and said in a cold voice, "Mrs. Hello Eyes, our goal is the same, that is to catch Jackwell John. So you..." Before Vereen finished speaking, Mrs. Hello Eyes stood up and left her seat, saying expressionlessly, "I'm sorry, Miss Team Leader," I said, "I have no comment." Seeing the back of Mrs. Hello Eyes pushing open the door and leaving the conference room, Vereen's face was as ugly as it could be. Luo An on the other end of the phone also heard the conversation between the two just now, and his expression was also very ugly. "Sir, you go back to the headquarters first, Luo An." Vereen picked up the coffee on the table and took a big sip, and then her voice was as cold as ice. "I will figure this out." "Okay, sir." Hearing the busy tone after the phone was hung up, Luo An's mouth suddenly opened. Vereen is not very cunning. The CIA people didn't even bother to give her a perfunctory treatment this time. "Let's go, Reed, back to headquarters." Putting away his phone, Roan stood up and stretched. "I have a feeling that this case can be solved today." Reed tilted his head in confusion. Roan was about to give him a simple explanation when the phone in his pocket rang again. "I have received several calls in the past few minutes." Roan took out his phone with a speechless face and pressed the answer button. Mona's familiar voice came from the other end of the phone. "Roan, I should know where Jackwell John and Thomas are now." Chapter 121 The truth behind the original mission and the explosion at the federal prosecutor's office. According to Mona's description, a federal prosecutor named John King bought a school bag of the same style for his son who was in elementary school a month ago. Hearing Mona's words, Roan went downstairs with Reed and asked calmly, "Mona, why do you think that Jackwell's target is this John King?" The other end of the phone suddenly fell silent. Roan narrowed his eyes and nodded to indicate Reed to get in the car first. He would go there later. He walked to a corner with his mobile phone and asked in a low voice, "Mona, is it inconvenient to talk?" After a long silence, Mona on the other end of the phone stood up and left her workstation, took her mobile phone, and walked to the corner of the number 5 investigation team. After taking a deep breath, Mona whispered, "Roan, not long ago, I hacked into my father's computer." Hearing this, Roan's face twitched. According to Mona's description, she had seen a photo of Mrs. Hello Eyes when she was young in her father's study when she was a child. When Roan entered the conference room for a meeting before, Mona was not at her workstation. In fact, Mona went to the bathroom with her laptop to check if she remembered it correctly. Later, after learning from Roan that the case was related to her father, Mona hesitated for a moment and finally decided to hack into her father's computer to see what the mission was all about. To Mona's disappointment, her father's computer did not have any information about the mission. However, Mona found a photo in the computer which showed not only her father, but also Jackwell John. In that photo, there is also John King, whom I just mentioned, but at that time he was called Owen Avery. Judging from the clothes and positions in the photo, John King, also known as Owen Avery, he and my father are officers, and Jackie and the others are soldiers. Mona continued, when I was looking for people who bought this backpack just now, I accidentally found the photo of this John King, so I looked up the identity of this John King. Hearing this, Luo An nodded with his chin on his hand. So, this John King is actually a CIA. He is a CIA who just retired not long ago. He is older and his rank should be higher than my father. Mona on the other end of the phone had a very serious expression and her voice was very solemn. Later, I carefully investigated the financial situation of this John King and found that at some time a year ago, there was suddenly a large amount of money in his bank account that had been taxed, but of unknown origin. That time point a year ago was the time when the mission set by Mona's father failed, and Jacqui and other soldiers were judged dead. Obviously, John King obtained a large sum of money through that mission. And the price was the lives of soldiers like Jacqui John. Thank you, Mona. After listening to Mona's narration, Roan was silent for a while and whispered, you have worked hard to find John King from so many people who have bought that backpack. Mona was stunned at first and then understood the subtext of Roan's mouth and the corners of her mouth suddenly rose. You're welcome, it's all I should do. Then, Mona told Roan all the specific information about John King's home address and workplace, and hung up the phone after a few simple words. Sitting in the driver's seat of the SUV, Roan signaled Riyadh to check the equipment carefully, and then stepped on the accelerator to the bottom, to let the SUV rush onto the road. Called Lassie and asked her to go to John King's home immediately, and Roan and Riyadh went to the federal prosecutor's office in Manhattan, New York. Then Roan called Verines. In the office of the team leader of the number 5 investigation team, Verines looked at the data report she had just received. Her eyes narrowed slightly. The report was sent to her by Secretary Clement, and the content was the general situation of the original mission. Although it was just a general situation without too many details, Verines still saw the trick in the mission. Javari Evans had said that the intelligence was incomplete and the operation could not be carried out so quickly, but his suggestion was directly rejected by his superior Rowan Avery, and the operation was carried out directly at 10 o'clock that night. Then the operation failed completely, and all the soldiers who carried out the mission died without exception. But in fact, Jacqui John survived. Owen Avery. Looking at the name in the file, Verines pondered for a few seconds, put the file away, and then walked into the conference room alone. Without any nonsense, she asked coldly, Mrs. Hello Eyes, what exactly do you CIA want to do? And, where is that Owen Avery now? Hearing Verines' words, Mrs. Hello Eyes raised her eyebrows immediately. She didn't expect Verines to find out Owen Avery's name. But knowing it was useless, Mrs. Hello Eyes curled her lips slightly, glanced at the busy detectives in the office area of the 5th investigation team, and sneered. I'm sorry Madam Team Leader, Ding-ling-ling. Mrs. Hello Eyes' face froze, because Verines' mobile phone rang again. Glancing at the old lady sitting on the chair, Verines pressed the answer button. After seeing the identity of the caller, I'm Verines. Hello, sir. Turning the steering wheel and turning the dark SUV to another road, Roan stepped on the accelerator and said, we have roughly guessed where Jacqui John and Thomas will go next. Concealing the fact that Mona hacked into his father's computer, Roan said that Mona found a person named John King by investigating people who bought the same school bag. John King? Verines tilted her head in confusion after hearing this. Who is this person? Mrs. Hello Eyes' face suddenly changed when she heard this name. Verines' eyes lit up when she saw this. After a moment's hesitation, she pressed the speaker button. Roan's explanation came from the phone. Sir, this John King was formerly called Owen Avery, a former CIA. Verines' eyes became brighter and brighter when she heard the voice from the phone. She didn't expect Roan's investigation to be so fast. She had planned to hand over the information she had just obtained to the number 5 investigation team to help them improve the speed and direction of the investigation. When Mrs. Hello Eyes heard the voice from the phone, her face became more and more ugly. When she heard Roan say that she and Riyadh were about to arrive at the Manhattan Federal Prosecutor's office, Mrs. Hello Eyes finally couldn't hold it anymore. Her face was full of anger, her eyes were full of anger, and she shouted in a very sharp voice, damn it. Agent Roan Greenwood, I order you to stop the investigation immediately. Immediately. Stop. Now. Hearing Mrs. Hello Eyes' shouting, Verines was stunned at first, and then she became angry and slammed the table heavily. Bang. Verines was about to speak when a deafening explosion suddenly sounded from the other end of the line. Boom. Chapter 122 John King's death. The sudden explosion startled Verines and Madame Hello Eyes. The next second, Verines, with a tense face, hurriedly asked loudly on the phone, "Luo An, how are you doing over there?" No one answered on the other end of the phone. Verines looked down and saw that the other party had hung up the phone. She called again but no one answered. Verines turned around with an extremely ugly face and looked at the old lady beside her. "Madame Hello Eyes, shouldn't you give me an explanation?" At this time, Madame Hello Eyes' expression was also not good. The situation in front of her seemed to be beyond their original plan. Hearing Verines' words, Madame Hello Eyes hesitated for a few seconds. Just as she was about to say something, Verines put away her phone and turned to the door of the conference room. Verines is now anxious to hand over this news to the number 5 investigation team and at the same time ask the number 5 investigation team to send someone to the scene to check the situation as soon as possible. When they reached the door of the conference room, Verines turned her back to Madame Hello Eyes and said in a cold voice, "Madame Hello Eyes, I'm too lazy to listen to your perfunctory words. I will report this matter later. And you'd better think carefully about how to deal with those people from the federal prosecutor's office." After that, Verines directly opened the door of the conference room and strode out. Hearing Verines' words, and then seeing her back arranging tasks for Augustus in the office area of the number 5 investigation team, Madame Hello Eyes' eyebrows rose in anger, and her face turned red and white. Damn it. After a few curses in a low voice, Madame Hello Eyes immediately took out her mobile phone and found a number to dial out. In this situation, it is more important to first find out the specific situation of the explosion. Not only that, Madame Hello Eyes has some other ideas. For example, let the CIA agents who were hiding nearby before catch the criminals who caused the explosion before the FBI. As long as the person is in their hands, the rest of the things will be easy. Time goes back to before the explosion. Mrs. Hello Eyes' sharp voice suddenly rang out on the phone. Roan didn't react much, looking calm. Riyad, who was sitting in the passenger seat checking his pistol, was frightened and his hands trembled. However, after hearing Mrs. Hello Eyes' order, Roan and Riyad looked at each other and grinned disdainfully. They didn't care about the order of the old CIA lady. At this time, the car had arrived at the road diagonally opposite the federal prosecutor's office. While preparing to park, Roan coughed lightly with a smile. Just as he was about to say a few words to retort to Mrs. Hello Eyes, a deafening explosion suddenly came from the gate of the federal prosecutor's office diagonally opposite. Boom. Shit. The sudden explosion scared Roan. Riyad, who was also frightened, cursed and immediately opened the car door and jumped out of the car. At this time, the small square outside the gate of the federal prosecutor's office was in chaos. Passers-by ran around, screaming from the bomb and wailing from the injured, and collapsed on the ground. When Riyad ran out of the SUV, Roan immediately hung up the phone and ran out of the car. Seeing Riyad about to run towards the gate of the federal prosecutor's office, Roan quickly reached out and grabbed him, shouting, "Riyad, wait a minute." Riyad, who was in a running posture, was pulled hard by Roan and almost stumbled forward and fell to the ground. Riyad quickly adjusted his body posture and stood up. His face was full of surprise, and he was even more shocked by Roan's strength. "What's wrong, Roan?" But the situation was urgent, and it was not the time to struggle. Riyad thought Roan was worried that there were bombs nearby, so he immediately said, "Don't worry, Roan. Based on my previous experience in SWAT, there is a high probability that there will be no second bomb here." Roan quickly checked his equipment and confirmed that there was no problem with the plate armor vest plus stun grenade plus smoke bomb plus Glock 18 plus extended magazine. He carefully looked at the people running around and explained to Riyad, "The murderers who caused this explosion are most likely Jacqueline and Thomas. They are most likely still at the scene. We have to find and catch them next." The reason why Jacqueline and Thomas are most likely at the scene now is mainly because of the previous car accident. After the car accident, Thomas went to the scene as an ambulance driver to check whether Evander was dead. The target of the bomb this time is John King. Judging from Jacqueline and Thomas's determination to take revenge, they will definitely check to see if John King is dead after the explosion. What? Okay. Hearing Roan's words, Riyad paused, then nodded decisively and agreed. Then he carefully observed the surroundings and asked, how to do it specifically? You go left, and I go right. Search carefully. Roan didn't waste words, took out the Glock 18, and held it in his hand, and said quickly, Jackwell is 36 years old this year, strong and has a buzz cut. Thomas is not young, has a high voice, and has long hair with white hair. Okay. Finding the target person among many passers-by is a basic skill for SWAT action members. Hearing the specific action plan, Riyad immediately took out the Glock 18 like Roan and rushed into the crowd on the left side of the federal prosecutor's office. Fully armed, Roan rushed into the crowd on the right side of the federal prosecutor's office, scanning the faces of every running passerby, and quickly ran to the high platform on the right side of the prosecutor's office. There is a small square in front of the federal prosecutor's office. Enter the square and climb a high staircase to enter the gate of the federal prosecutor's office. The explosion site is at the gate of the prosecutor's office. If the other party wants to check whether John King is dead, they must come to this high platform. At the same time, standing on the high platform, Luo An could also scan everyone at the scene more clearly. In the shocked eyes of passers-by, the fully armed Luo An seemed not tired at all, and ran to the top of the stairs in a few seconds. FBI. Luo An took out the golden badge from his pocket, and showed it to the bald security guard of the procuratorate who collapsed on the ground. While carefully observing the surroundings, Luo An tore open the security guard's clothes to help him stop bleeding, and asked, did you see the specific situation when the explosion occurred? The bald security guard nodded, indicating that he saw the explosion came from a little boy's school bag. At that time, the little boy handed the school bag to his father, and the father asked the little boy what was in the school bag and why it was so heavy. The next second, the explosion occurred, and the father died on the spot. The little boy's father, named John King, is a federal prosecutor. After listening to the bald security guard's narration, Luo An licked his lips and said nothing. While carefully observing the crowd, Luo An was about to continue asking questions when a fierce exchange of fire suddenly came from the left side of the procuratorate. Bang, 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 bang. Fouquet. Upon hearing the gunshot, Luo An immediately stuffed the cloth strip to the security guard and rushed to the left side of the procuratorate. On the left side of the procuratorate, the fully armed Riyad was squatting on the side of a car, avoiding the enemy behind the SUV opposite and the whistling rain of bullets fired here. The enemy was holding a rifle and had long white hair. Just now, Riyad just asked the other party to stop, and the other party decisively shot at him. Riyad was sure that the other party was definitely the guy named Thomas. The other party had a rifle in his hand, and Riyad, who only had a Glock 18, did not dare to confront him head on. However, thinking of the previous combat experience with Luo An, Riyad smiled slightly and took out a stun grenade from behind his butt. But just as Riyad got into position and was ready to throw the stun grenade to the opposite side, Riyad suddenly saw 4 stun grenades flying towards the opposite SUV above his head. Riyad. Thomas. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 123 CIA fails to snatch people. Seeing the 4 stun grenades in the sky, Riyad's mouth twitched, and he instantly understood who was coming. Son of, eat. Thomas behind the SUV cursed. His voice was sharp, and he quickly bent down to avoid it. Bang, 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 bang. 4 stun grenades exploded one after another, and the windows of several nearby cars were instantly shattered all over the ground. After throwing the stun grenades, the fully armed drone slid over the front of a car and quickly arrived beside Riyad. He bent down and asked in a serious tone, "Ryder, are you okay?" "No problem." Riyad patted his chest to indicate that he was not injured. Roan nodded, holding the Glock 18, slowly stood up, and walked to the back of the SUV with Riyad on the left and right in a tactical posture. As expected by the two, Thomas, who was baptized by 4 stun grenades, had completely fainted and collapsed on the ground. Roan carefully took the rifle beside Thomas, and Reed took out handcuffs and handcuffed Thomas' hands behind his back. After carefully searching Thomas' pockets and the sub next to him, Roan successfully found a driver's license. Demonte Adams. Looking at the photo on the driver's license, Roan smacked his lips. Ryder beside him blinked. It seems that this is Thomas' real name. Maybe. Roan shrugged, took out his cell phone, called Mona, and asked her to check this guy. Just after hanging up the phone, a middle-aged white man wearing an FBI grey blue jacket and a Glock pistol on his waist, accompanied by a white youth dressed the same but younger, came from a distance. "Hello, my name is Terry, from the Counter-Improvised Explosive Device Division, a division of the FBI. See the introduction for details." The middle-aged white man in the lead stretched out his hand and shook hands with Roan and Reed, and asked with a smile, "Excuse me, is this guy you arrested the murderer who caused the explosion just now?" Reed raised his eyebrows and was about to speak, but Roan immediately patted his arm, then tilted his head and smiled and replied, "No." When Terry and his teammates heard this, their faces froze. "Anything else?" Roan's smile was very sunny. "If not, we will leave first." After saying that, without waiting for Terry and Reed to answer, Roan patted Reed's arm, indicating that he should take Thomas away from here, and walk towards the sub not far away. "Wait a minute, guys." Roan and Reed had not taken a few steps when Terry and Reed caught up with them, and at the same time, stretched out their hands to block Roan and Reed, and smiled. "You." Terry couldn't continue his words halfway, because Roan took out his Glock 18. Seeing this, Terry's teammates subconsciously reached for the pistol on their waist. "Mr. Terry." Roan narrowed his eyes and waved his hand to signal Reed to take Thomas back to the sub first, then smiled and said to Terry, "I know what your mission is, and you also know what our mission is. But we caught him, and we will only take him back, okay?" From the first time he saw Terry, Roan felt very uncomfortable. In addition, Terry only introduced his identity and name just now, but did not ask Roan and Reed's identities. Roan immediately judged that the other party knew him. Then, hearing that the target in Terry's words was Thomas, Roan thought briefly and guessed the other party's true identity: CIA under Mrs. Hello Eyes. As for why the CIA has FBI clothes and equipment, again, the United States has its own national conditions. On the surface, federal law stipulates that the CIA is not allowed to operate domestically, but in fact, the CIA's activities within the federal territory have never been less. It's just that most of the time these CIAs are just a cover, claiming to be from the FBI, NSA and other departments. Seeing that his identity was discovered by Roan, Terry stopped pretending, and his face became serious. "Agent Roan, we must take this guy away." "Impossible." Roan licked his lips, and the smile on his face became more sunny and harmonious, but his right hand slowly placed on the safety position of the Glock 18. "Again, we caught this person." Hearing Roan's words, Terry's young teammate next to him slowly raised his eyebrows and pretended to pull out the pistol on his waist. "No." Seeing this, Terry stretched out his hand to suppress his teammate's action, then stared at Roan with his eyes, lowered his voice and said, "Are you sure you don't want to hand him over?" Roan did not answer, but just laughed, and slowly opened the safety of the Glock 18 with his right hand. The two looked at each other for a moment, and finally Terry nodded with a gloomy face. "But, the person is yours." After saying that, Terry did not hesitate, and immediately pulled the white youth next to him and turned away. Looking at the backs of the two, Roan narrowed his eyes, slowly put away his Glock 18, and after thinking for a moment, he chuckled. It seems that the CIA is much more chaotic than the FBI. Turning back to the SUV, Roan took out his cell phone and called Mona after learning that Reed had contacted the ambulance. After Mona's investigation, this Demonte Adams had served in some foreign regions before, and several places where Demonte served overlapped with John King. Roan nodded. "That's right. It's likely that he is another ordinary soldier who was tricked by John King." After hanging up the phone with Mona, Roan called Vereen's again. The call was quickly connected. "Good afternoon, sir." Hearing Roan's familiar voice, Vereen's, who was in the meeting room of the number 5 investigation team, subconsciously breathed a sigh of relief. Glancing at Mrs. Hello Eyes, who was standing in the corner of the conference room and talking on the phone with a gloomy face, Verines asked coldly, "What's the situation at the scene?" "The carrier of the explosion is the school bag bomb." Roan briefly recounted the words of the bald security guard, saying that John King was killed on the spot and the child's life or death was unknown. He has now been sent to the hospital for rescue. Hearing the news that John King was killed on the spot, Verines raised her eyebrows and asked immediately, "Have you caught the murderer?" "Not yet." Roan said that Jackal has never shown up and they don't know where he is hiding. "But we caught Thomas. His real name is DeMonte Adams." After briefly describing the information Mona found out to Verines, Roan finally concluded, "Through DeMonte, we should be able to find out where Jackal is hiding." "Very good." Verines nodded with satisfaction. Later, when she heard that Mrs. Hello Eyes had sent someone to try to rob people, Verines immediately showed a hint of disdain and said that she would deal with this matter later, and then hung up the phone. On the other side, in the corner of the conference room, after learning that Terry failed to snatch Thomas from Roan, Mrs. Hello Eyes' eyes were filled with anger, and her face was as ugly as it could be. Before Mrs. Hello Eyes could scold, Verines' cold words came from behind her. "Mrs. Hello Eyes, can we talk now?" Looking down at the information in her hand and Roan's account of the case, Verines licked the corner of her mouth. She now has a general understanding of the background and the whole process of this case, as well as Mrs. Hello Eyes' role in it. Chapter 124 The Truth of the Case and Luo An's Promotion. The situation behind this case is not complicated. In the operation a year ago, John King sent the soldiers who carried out the operation to hell for money, but Jackal survived by chance. After investigation, the CIA senior management learned that John King's corruption led to the failure of the mission. When thinking about how to deal with John King, the CIA accidentally learned from the NSA that Jackal was still alive. So within the CIA, the forces of Mrs. Hello Eyes planned to take advantage of the situation and let Jackal kill John King in revenge, and then they would get rid of Jackal. This can not only erase the scandal that CIA officials use the lives of grassroots soldiers to make money for themselves, but also strike at the internal forces of the CIA that supported John King and obtain benefits and bargaining chips. The CIA has no one in charge. It is an independent department, and it mainly operates outside the federal border, so the various forces within them are more complicated, and the situation of mountains and hills has never stopped since the establishment of the CIA. The plan of Mrs. Hello Eyes' faction is beautiful, but reality will not move forward steadily according to their ideas. Because Jackal's role in the army was a sniper, Mrs. Hello Eyes and the others naturally thought that Jackal's means of revenge on John King was long-range sniping. But what they didn't expect was that after Jackal returned to the federal territory, he did not take revenge immediately, but first found a helper for himself and bought materials to make bombs. Mrs. Hello Eyes and the others knew that Jackal was preparing a bomb, but they didn't know what the carrier outside the bomb would be, so they immediately investigated the identity of Thomas. But before they could investigate clearly, the car accident happened, and it also attracted the attention of the New York FBI Criminal Investigation Department. There is a chain of contempt between the various departments of the United States, and the CIA has always looked down on the FBI. So Mrs. Hello Eyes just sneered at the FBI's involvement in the investigation and didn't take it to heart at all. She didn't think that the so-called number 5 investigation team would have any impact on their plan. In her opinion, maybe after the plan is completely over, this number 5 investigation team is still studying the interpersonal relationships of Evander, the victim of the car accident. Then the agent named Ron Greenwood took his teammates to teach Mrs. Hello Eyes a good lesson. They caught the white man with a short haircut and sent him to the hospital. Then, based on the video, they found that something was wrong with the ambulance driver and found the base where Thomas and Jackal had stayed. Later, they even found John King's identity. Ron's series of actions slapped Mrs. Hello Eyes' wrinkled face, especially after learning that Ron had driven to John King's workplace with his teammates. Mrs. Hello Eyes couldn't hold it anymore, so she screamed at the phone in anger. However, Mrs. Hello Eyes still underestimated Ron, because Ron not only caught Thomas before her men took action, but also saw through the identities of her men and firmly grasped Thomas in the hands of the FBI. The following were the thoughts in Verines' mind. She did not tell Mrs. Hello Eyes, but just swallowed her saliva silently, ready to give Roan a little more reward when she returned. Mrs. Hello Eyes, after briefly describing the CIA's original plan to take advantage of the situation and the incident, Verines leaned back, crossed her legs, and asked in a cold voice, "Is there anything wrong with what I just said?" Mrs. Hello Eyes, who was standing in the corner of the conference room with her mobile phone, frowned and cursed in her heart after hearing Verines' statement that was basically the same as their original plan. However, Mrs. Hello Eyes was so old after all, she was experienced, and her emotions were stable very quickly. After taking a deep breath, Mrs. Hello Eyes turned around and sat on the chair, crossed her hands on the table, looked at Verines expressionlessly, and said, "Ms. Team Leader, I have only one answer to your question just now, that is, no. No comment, I know." Before Mrs. Hello Eyes finished speaking, Verines waved her hand nonchalantly and took it over. This action made Mrs. Hello Eyes' face gloomy again. But Verines' actions that made Mrs. Hello Eyes look unhappy were not the only ones. Verines continued to say, "I have just reported the whole process of this case to my superiors. After consultation with the federal prosecutor's office, my superiors agreed to the application of the number 5 investigation team to withdraw from the investigation of this case. This sentence means that the New York FBI has communicated with the federal prosecutor's office about the case of the explosion at the gate of the federal prosecutor's office. After the communication, the number 5 investigation team will not be responsible for the follow-up matters. The CIA will be responsible for the mess it has made. Of course, the people arrested by the FBI naturally belong to the FBI." Hearing this, Mrs. Hello Eyes' face trembled, and swear words almost came out of her mouth. The FBI clearly did not want to take the blame, and then threw the pot back to the CIA. Verines glanced at the other party's wrinkled old face. A disdainful smile appeared at the corner of her mouth, and she stood up and walked towards the door of the conference room. "By the way, Madam Hello Eyes, there is one more thing." When she reached the door of the conference room, Verines seemed to suddenly remember something. She slapped her head, raised her lips slightly, and tilted her head to say, "The FBI New York branch will issue a wanted order for Jacqueline in a little while, and the expected reward is $1 million. The money will be paid by your CIA." The fact that the wanted order was issued so quickly was ultimately due to the CIA, who caused the explosion to happen at the door of the federal prosecutor's office. After saying that, Verines flashed a smile on her face, and then she turned around, opened the door of the conference room, and walked out quickly. In the conference room, hearing Verines' words, and looking at Verines' back, Madam Hello Eyes' lips trembled, her face turned green, and she almost vomited blood in anger. Damn Jackal. Damn FBI. Half an hour later, Thomas was taken into the interrogation room of the 5th investigation team. Luo An and Riyadh returned to their workstations to drink a sip of coffee, preparing to rest for a while before interrogating each other. At this moment, Verines and Augustus suddenly came over. "Sir." Seeing this, Roan, Riyadh, Mona, Lacey and others hurriedly greeted him. "Everyone has worked hard today." Verines was in a good mood. She waved her hand to signal that there was no need to be so. They all sat down, then handed the folder in her hand to Roan and said calmly, "Roan, this is the document for your promotion to senior agent. Please sign it." Pa. Congratulations, Roan." Hearing Verines' words, Augustus, Riyadh, Lacey and others smiled and applauded Roan. Mona also applauded and looked at Roan with envy. "Thank you, sir." Roan took the folder and smiled. After signing the promotion document at the bottom of the first page, Roan found that there was another piece of paper at the back. He flipped it open and saw that it was the notice of the Columbus Foundation's level upgrade. Originally, when Roan was an ordinary agent, the annual rate of return within the foundation was at the level of a senior agent. Now that Luo An is a senior agent, the annual rate of return within the foundation has been upgraded to the level of supervising special agents, that is, team leaders. Seeing this, Luo An closed the folder and smiled even more. "Thank you for your support and help, sir." Verines nodded, then tilted her head to look at the interrogation room on the side. Chapter 125. Where is Jacqueline hiding? The Thomas in the interrogation room is Thomas. His real name is DeMonte Adams. Seeing Verine's eyes, Mona beside her tapped on the keyboard with 10 fingers and then explained, his experience is similar to Jacquel's. They are both soldiers who were harmed by John King. Okay. Hearing Mona's words, Verines nodded, then tilted her head to look at everyone, indicating that the case was over here and the arrest warrant for Jacquel would be issued soon. It was almost time to get off work, and it was time to go home. Thank you, sir. The agents of the 5th investigation team cheered when they heard this. Verine saw this, and the corners of her mouth rose slightly. After looking at Luo An with satisfaction, she turned around and left. Mona raised her eyebrows, tilted her head to look at Augustus, and asked in confusion, "Sir, are we still interrogating DeMonte?" Augustus heard this, and patted his big belly without saying anything. Previously, Roan and Riyad were asked to arrest DeMonte and bring him back, because the case was still under the jurisdiction of Investigation Team 5, and they were also worried that, if the CIA caught the murderer before them, the initiative would be reversed. But tomorrow, this case will no longer belong to Investigation Team 5, and Verines also said that the case would end here, so it's okay to interrogate him. After thinking for a few seconds, Augustus's big black face showed a smile. It is said that the reward on Jacquel's wanted warrant is worth $1 million if you ask DeMonte about Jacquel's hiding place. Hearing this, Mona's eyes lit up instantly, and then she quickly turned her head and cast her eyes on Roan beside her. Seeing Mona's eyes, Roan grinned, drank a sip of coffee, and walked into the interrogation room with Mona. 40 minutes later, Roan and Mona walked out of the interrogation room. Why did it take so long? Lassie stretched at her workstation, pointed to the clock at the front of the number 5 investigation team's office, and said with a smile, "There are 5 minutes left before the end of the get off work. Did you find out anything useful?" "No." Mona shook her head in frustration, threw the notebook in her hand on the table, and sighed. Lassie raised her eyebrows and turned her eyes to Roan. Facing Lassie's puzzled expression, Roan threw the folder aside with a helpless look on his face, drank a sip of coffee, and slowly explained. When he and Mona were interrogating DeMonte just now, DeMonte didn't say a word from beginning to end. Not only that, Roan saw that there was no light in DeMonte's eyes. The other party was obviously in the state of mind that he had avenged his great hatred and died without regrets. In addition, the information Mona found showed that DeMonte's parents were dead. He had no brothers or sisters, no wife or children, and he was a pure lonely man. Facing such a person with no worries, Roan and Mona tried every possible way, but they couldn't make DeMonte speak. Finally, Roan and Mona unanimously decided, although the bounty is high, forget it. First of all, Jacquel's anti-reconnaissance ability and planning and organization ability are very strong. Whether it is a car accident or a bombing, Jacquel has never shown up. When William investigated the surveillance in and around the building where the ambulance driver lived, he only saw the footage of Jacquel entering and leaving the building. But after leaving the building, Jacquel's figure disappeared completely, as if he had evaporated in that area. Where the other party is now, I'm afraid only DeMonte knows, but DeMonte doesn't speak. Even the place DeMonte knows may not be where Jacquel is hiding. Faced with this situation, in a densely populated place like New York, it is impossible to find Jacquel in a short time without the big data analysis of later generations. Second, John King sent Jacquel and his comrades to hell for money. To be honest, if this happened to Roan would also choose revenge. The only problem is that in the process of revenge, Jacquel accidentally killed the innocent Evander by causing a car accident, and also accidentally injured a lot of passers-by by making a bomb. Jacquel's bounty is indeed high, and Roan also wants it very much. If he encounters him by chance in the future, Roan will definitely arrest him. But now Jacquel can't be found in the short term, and these 2 cases were made by those damn CIA, so Roan is too lazy to clean up their ass. The interrogation was not completely finished, but it was time to get off work today. The agents of the number 5 investigation team went back to their homes. Mona took her notebook back to her newly bought small apartment. Ryder drove home to see the children, and Roan followed Lassie to the place on the small card. Mainly want to see the world. HMPH. Lassie, who was sitting in the passenger seat of the Chevrolet, heard Luo An's words and curled her lips. After we enter, we must separate. How to play tonight and how many people to meet will depend on our own abilities. But there is a premise: we can't do anything to the person that the other person likes. Okay, no problem. Stepping on the accelerator, the Chevrolet easily surpassed the book in front. Luo An tilted his head and asked with a smile, "But what if we both like the same person?" Lassie took out the cosmetics hidden somewhere and slowly applied them on her face. After hearing Luo An's question, she winked and smiled. "Then give the right to choose to the person we both like and see who she chooses." Lassie has been to many such happy places and has rich experience, so she is very confident in herself. That's settled. Luo An has a handsome face and a good figure, so he is also very confident in himself. Nodding in agreement, Luo An turned the steering wheel, and the Chevrolet sped forward on the road with endless traffic, overtaking one car after another. Feeling that Roan was driving faster and faster, Lassie touched her seatbelt calmly. After confirming that there was no problem, she swallowed her saliva and said, "Roan, it's time to get off work now. We are not going to catch that jackal. You don't have to drive so fast." Lassie has been confused these days. Roan always drives so fast. Has he never encountered a NYPD patrolman giving him a speeding ticket? "Lassie, there is a saying in the East across the ocean, time is money." Roan laughed, saying that he attaches great importance to money and never wastes money. Shit. After putting on makeup, Lassie magically disappeared the makeup in her hand and then threw a pair of sanitary balls to Roan, shouting loudly, "Time is indeed equal to money, but money can't buy time. Damn Roan, drive slower. I don't want to be like John King, who lost all his time for money." The example given by Lassie, a pure American, was a little inappropriate, but Roan understood what she meant. In order to see more scenery in the future, Luo An finally chose to slow down the car. Huh. Lassie snorted coldly, took out her mobile phone and started typing. After a long time, she whispered, "By the way, Luo An, do you think the CIA can find that jackal?" Luo An tilted his head in confusion. "Why do you ask this question?" "William just sent me a message saying that the CIA group wants to interrogate DeMonte now." Lassie showed the information in her mobile phone to Luo An, shrugged and said, "He suspects that the CIA may have obtained some new clues that we don't know. It's not impossible." Luo An glanced at the phone and frowned slightly. The CIA group didn't tell the truth. God knows what clues they have hidden in their hands. Besides, they have been monitoring Jackal before. Maybe they have deduced Jackal's next target based on Jackal's previous actions. As he spoke, Luo An paused, and then his face suddenly changed, and he cursed, "Fouquet, I know where Jackal is hiding." End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.